Something doesn't add up here, and it's been bugging me for weeks. How did Native American tribes survive in places where even modern technology fails? In this video, I'm sharing the unbelievable truth about these ancient survival masters that will blow your mind. What you're about to discover will literally change how you see human potential forever. This journey into their secret world starts now. But before we dive in, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more mind-blowing history, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. The valley sleeps beneath a blanket of fog, not the gentle mist of morning dew, but a cold, creeping silence that slips between the trunks of thousand-year-old redwoods. It hovers low over the black waters of the Trinity River, tracing the sharp edges of rock and soil that have not changed in 1,000 lifetimes. This is Hooper Valley, a land carved by fire and flood, by survival and ceremony. Here, nature does not whisper. It speaks in the crack of falling limbs, the breath of wind that never stops moving, and in the steady rhythm of water-cutting stone. For the Hooper people, the original keepers of this valley, the land was not a backdrop to their lives. It was their life. Every bend of the river, every shadow on the canyon wall held a memory older than the tribe itself. The valley stretches like a long wound in the earth, running 20 miles along the Trinity River, hemmed in by steep, forested ridges. Trees reach upward like frozen flames, Douglas fir, sugar pine, and coast redwood, their roots tangled in a competition older than history. When rain comes, it comes heavy. When the sun returns, the fog remains, holding secrets in its folds. To outsiders, it was wilderness, impenetrable, remote. But to the Hooper, this was the center of the world. They called themselves Natinixwi, people of the place where the trails return, a name born not of conquest, but of connection. Every footpath in this valley led home. Every tree, a marker. Every ripple of the river, a voice. And above all else, the valley itself was alive. There is an old Hooper story that says, the valley was formed by the battle between the fire spirit and the river spirit, one born of flame and ash, the other of ice and shadow. They clashed beneath the mountains in a storm of fury, burning and flooding the land until it was carved into balance. Fire retreated to the hills, water flowed into the basin. And from that union, the valley was born, a place where destruction gave way to harmony, a place forged in tension. Centuries before the first European foot ever touched this soil, the Hooper were already here, building, harvesting, surviving. They moved with the seasons like shadows in the timber. Summers were for gathering, acorns, berries, medicinal roots. Winters were for stories, told around fires that crackled inside conical redwood plank houses. Each flame rising like a thread toward the heavens. The valley tested them constantly. Landslides crushed trails. Bears stalked the river's edge. Storms stripped bark from trees. But still they stayed, not because it was easy, but because it was sacred. The Trinity River was their lifeline. It flowed cold and strong, fed by snowmelt from distant peaks. In spring, salmon would return in thick silver waves, fighting upstream with bruised fins and battered scales. The Hooper waited with spears and woven traps, watching with reverence. Salmon were not just food, they were ancestors reborn. Each catch was a gift, taken with ceremony, with apology, and with fire. But it was fire, controlled and deliberate, that gave the Hooper mastery of this valley. Where others feared it, they wielded it like a tool. Every spring, small blazes were set beneath oak groves and berry thickets, not to destroy, but to renew. Fire cleared the underbrush, fertilized the soil, coaxed new life from ash. It brought deer into clearings, it sweetened the acorns, and it ensured the land never forgot its people. In this world, survival wasn't measured by dominance, but by balance. To take too much was to invite ruin. To ignore the signs was to starve. And the Hooper learned early. The valley was generous, but never forgiving. When morning fog lifted, it revealed not villages, but ecosystems sculpted by human hands. Trails were not just paths, they were arteries. Fire pits were not random, they marked seasonal migration points. What appeared wild was, in truth, maintained, not with saws and fences, but with ceremony and memory. No fence lines marked ownership because the land was not owned. It was honored, understood. The Hooper believed the world was layered, not in soil or stone, but in spirit. There were places in the valley where the veil between worlds was thin, a rock shaped like a sleeping bear, a spring that bubbled even in drought, a circle of trees that never grew taller. These were sacred sites, avoided by hunters, approached only by medicine men. Even today, some elders will not speak their names aloud. The valley could shelter, but it could also punish. There were winters where snow fell so thick it collapsed roofs and froze the river. There were drought years when the salmon never came, and the people lived on dried mushrooms and bark tea. There were fires that escaped the hand and raced up canyon walls in a fury of smoke and ember. But the Hooper endured, because they understood something the outside world forgot. You do not conquer the land. You learn from it, you listen, you watch, and the valley remembers. By the time white settlers stumbled upon the Hooper Valley in the early 1800s, they saw only isolation and resource. Towering trees ripe for felling, rivers thick with fish, hills lined with ore. But what they didn't see, couldn't see, was the web of life already spinning beneath their boots. The knowledge woven into every tool, every ritual, every scar on the land. To them, it was wild, untouched. But to the Hooper, it was already a library of memory, a living map of survival and spirit. Even the winds knew the names of the old ones. On cold nights, when firewood was scarce and fog pressed against the redwood walls, children were told the story of the first spark, of how a hummingbird stole fire from the mountain gods and carried it in his beak, feathers singed, wings burning, to give warmth to the people, and how the gods, angered, cursed the valley to always remember the cost of that gift, which is why the fog never lifts, without fire close behind. Today, as clouds roll low across the valley floor and pine needles glisten with river mist, the story still echoes, in the pulse of the current, in the blackened trunks from ancient burns, in the silence that comes just before the storm. This land does not forget. It does not yield easily, but it welcomes those who speak its language. And in the valley of fog and fire, that language is survival. Spoken in embers, carved in stone, whispered through the trees. It is the language of the Hooper, and the valley still listens. They were not a people who came in conquest. They arrived with the seasons, slowly, steadily, long before written memory, long before maps carved up the world. The Hooper say they came from the north, following the river southward, guided not by ambition, but by the pull of the land. When they reached this valley, hemmed by mountains, cradled in redwood, and fed by the cold, living vein of the Trinity, they stopped. Not because they had reached the end, but because they had finally come home. The Hooper call themselves Natinixwi, the people of the place where the trails return. To outsiders, they became known simply as the Hooper, or people of the valley. But the name they carried within was older, deeper. It spoke of return, of belonging, of trails not merely walked, but remembered. In the beginning, there were no fences, no lines drawn in soil. What defined their world was rhythm, the rise and fall of river, the pulse of the salmon, the golden flood of acorns in autumn, the silence of snow. The Hooper did not seek to tame the land. They learned to breathe with it. Each clan, each extended family, held its own stories, its own dances, its own obligations to a specific piece of land or river. Some watched over the salmon pools. Others were tasked with maintaining the acorn groves or tending the fire trails in the forest above. These duties weren't assigned by law. They were passed down like songs, like prayers. Stewardship was survival, and survival required mastery. Along the river's edge, the men built fishing weirs, latticed walls of sharpened willow and stone that channeled the salmon into waiting traps. They fished not with greed, but with precision. Only what was needed. Only the strong ones, never the spawners. The rest were allowed to pass upriver to fulfill their ancient journey. Women harvested tule reeds from the swampy bends of the river, stripping them with practiced fingers, drying them in the sun, and weaving them into mats and baskets. Each pattern passed from mother to daughter like scripture. These baskets were not just tools, they were stories, stitched in fibre and ash, in porcupine quill and bear grass. A good basket could carry water without leaking a drop. A great one could carry memory. In the deep forest, the hunters walked silent as smoke. Their boughs were made of yew wood, a slow-growing tree prized for its flex and strength. They carved arrowheads from obsidian or bone, tipped with poison made from crushed plants and river frogs. Every shot counted. Every drop of blood drawn was acknowledged in ritual. There were no herds of livestock, no ploughs turning earth. But the land was farmed in a different way, not with iron, but with fire and patience. The Hooper understood what modern science would one day rediscover, that the forest is not wild, not truly. It can be guided, healed, shaped. Each spring, they set controlled fires along the ridges, low creeping burns that cleansed the brush without harming the great trees. These fires brought life. They cleared the way for deer trails. They coaxed new shoots of hazel and beargrass, vital materials for basketry and shelter. They kept the valley breathing. In late summer, when the berries hung heavy on the branches and the acorns began to fall, the people moved higher into the hills. There, among the oaks and madrones, families worked from sunup to sundown, gathering, drying, pounding. Acorns were ground into meal on stone mortars passed down for generations, stones whose surface bore the fingerprints of ancestors. The flour was leached of its bitterness with running water, then baked into a kind of bread, hearty, smoky, rich with the flavour of the earth. This was not a life of ease. It was a life of labour, repetition, and respect. And yet, it was full. A canoe carved from a single redwood log could take weeks to shape. The elders say the tree must first be asked for permission, its spirit honoured, its fall witnessed. Then the men would strip the bark, hollow the trunk with fire and stone tools, and smooth the sides with bone scrapers. When finished, the canoe would glide low on the water, able to hold a family, a harvest, or a warrior. The river was not merely a source of food, it was the spine of the people. At dawn, the young boys were sent to its edge to learn its moods, to understand when it whispered and when it roared. They were taught how to read the water's colour, how to listen for the fish, how to mend a net with their eyes closed. There was no written language, but there was literacy, of wind, of stone, of current. The elders spoke of spirits that lived beneath the surface, some helpful, some vengeful. It was said that to take too much salmon without offering thanks could bring sickness, that a canoe left untied on certain nights would vanish by morning, that every bend in the river had a name, a story, a warning. Children learned by watching, by doing. A 6-year-old could gut a fish cleanly. A 10-year-old could set a snare that would catch a rabbit without harming its hide. By adolescence, they were full participants in the cycle, neither coddled nor ignored. In this land, childhood was not a pause. It was preparation. The valley shaped them, and in return, they shaped the valley. There were no kings, no councils of war. Leadership was earned through generosity, wisdom, and spiritual knowledge. Medicine men held the deepest power, not through violence, but through vision. They were the ones who interpreted dreams, who knew the plants that healed or killed, who spoke the words at the changing of seasons. In their dances, the people did not seek to entertain, but to remember, to realign. When they performed the deerskin dance, it was not just to honor the deer, but to restore balance to the land itself. They danced for the river, for the mountains, for the fire and the wind. They danced for the dead and the unborn. Every movement was a prayer, every feather a map. And though the world beyond the ridgelines would eventually come crashing down, with its guns, its greed, its treaties written in lies, this time, this era, this way of life was built on something stronger than steel. It was built on memory, on repetition, on hands that knew the grain of wood, the weight of stone, the silence of snow before the kill. For hundreds of years, the people of the river lived not above nature, but within it. They walked its banks, climbed its trees, bled into its soil. They left no monuments of stone, no carved idols or towers. Their history lived in trails, in scars on trees, in basket patterns, in names whispered in the dark when the fire burned low. Even now, if you stand in the Hooper Valley before dawn, when the mist still clings to the trees and the river moves like muscle beneath the fog, you can feel it, a presence, not ghosts, not echoes, but memory. Muscle memory of a people who never forgot how to listen. They were the people of the river, and the river still remembers. In a world without iron, without steel, without a single forged blade, survival came down to what the earth could offer, and what the hands could shape. For the Hooper, tools were not just objects, they were lifelines, extensions of instinct, memory passed down in wood, stone, bone, and flame. Every item, from the smallest needle to the deadliest spear, had a purpose, a place, a story. The mountains around Hooper Valley were rich with obsidian, the volcanic glass as black as night, as sharp as betrayal. The men knew where to find it, high ridges where ancient lava had cooled into razor-thin sheets. They'd carry the raw stone back to the village wrapped in buckskin, careful not to shatter it. Then the work began, a slow, deliberate dance between hand and flake. A master flint napper could turn a chunk of obsidian into a deadly arrowhead in under an hour, using antler tines and pressure-flaking techniques passed down from grandfather to grandson. Each tip could slice through hide, muscle, even bone. The edges were sharper than surgical scalpels, and just as fragile. These arrowheads were then bound to hardwood shafts, using deer sinew and pine pitch, cured over a fire until they gleamed. The finished weapon was light, fast, and silent. In the dense forests of the valley, where visibility was often measured in yards, not miles, silence was survival. For larger prey, elk, bear, mountain lion, the Hooper relied on spears and harpoons. Some were tipped with bone, carved from the leg of a deer or the rib of a salmon. Others used fire-hardened tips, the wood itself charred and shaped over coals to a lethal point. Fire changed the nature of the wood, making it denser, stronger, and more resistant to splintering on impact. But a tool was only as good as the hands that used it. A hunter tracking elk through the fog-drenched hills moved with the patience of moss. He knew the wind's language. He could read broken twigs, crushed ferns, the way a single droplet of water trembled on a leaf. He carried no compass, no clock. Time was measured in breath, direction in instinct. In winter, when food grew scarce and the river ran high and angry, the people turned to traps. Snares were made from twisted plant fiber, usually dogbane or milkweed, braided into near-invisible loops and set along game trails. Deadfall traps, built from balanced logs and pressure triggers, could crush a rabbit instantly. Fish traps were more intricate, woven basket funnels staked into the shallows, baited with insects and bits of dried meat. Once inside, the fish could not escape. A single weir, properly placed, could feed an entire family for days. But even the simplest tasks required tools, and every tool had to be earned. Take the digging stick, a long, hardened shaft of oak or manzanita, its tip charred and sharpened in the fire. It was used for everything: harvesting camas roots, prying stones, loosening soil for planting tobacco or medicinal herbs. A skilled woman could dig a root as thick as her wrist without damaging a single hair-like tendril. The stick, held at just the right angle, would slip beneath the earth like a whisper. Fire-hardened and polished with stone, these digging sticks were often handed down through generations. Some were adorned with carvings, not decoration, but remembrance, marks that told where the stick had been, what it had unearthed, who it had fed. There were tools for weaving, bone awls made from elk or deer, smoothed by hours of polishing and used to pierce reeds and bark for basketry. There were stone adzes used to carve canoe hulls, their blades secured with rawhide lashings and wedged into U-handles. Each object was a marriage of form and function. No part of an animal was wasted. Antlers became flakers. Hooves were boiled for glue. Even the thin, curved ribs of salmon could be dried and used as sewing needles. Delicate enough to thread woven cloth, yet strong enough to pierce buckskin. Their packs, made from tanned deer hide, carried these tools everywhere. Rolled tightly, sealed with pitch, kept dry in baskets lined with bear grass. In a time where failure could mean starvation or death, redundancy was a luxury they could not afford. Fire, too, was a tool, perhaps the most important. To make fire without flint, the hooper used a hand drill, a straight dry stick spun between the palms into a baseboard of softer wood. It took friction, pressure, speed. The dust from the groove would heat, smoke, and, if the gods were willing, glow. The tiniest ember was then coaxed into flame using shredded bark and dry moss. Children were taught to do this before they learned to fish, because without fire, there was nothing. No cooked food, no light in the endless winter dark, no warmth when the fog sank heavy and the frost crept into the bones. A family without fire did not survive the night. It's easy now, in a world of lighters and knives, to overlook what it meant to make survival, to shape it from stone, from bone, from your own hands, to bend every waking moment towards staying alive one more day. But for the hooper, every tool told a story, of birth, of hunger, of war, of love. When a man died, his tools were often burned with him, not out of waste, but respect. They were considered extensions of his spirit, and his spirit needed them on the journey to the next world. To keep them behind would be to anchor him, to forget him. But sometimes, tools were passed on. When a father handed his son a fishing spear, it wasn't just wood and point. It was every fish that spear had taken. Every moment the river had threatened to swallow him whole. Every winter night it had kept hunger at bay. You didn't just carry a tool, you carried memory. Survival was not invention, it was inheritance. And so, when the white men came, with rifles that could kill from far beyond the reach of an arrow, with iron pots and steel blades, they saw the hooper's tools as primitive, crude, obsolete. But they missed the point entirely. These tools were not relics of a lesser people. They were the culmination of centuries, centuries of refinement, of trial and error, of knowing exactly how much force it takes to pierce a salmon's skull without damaging its meat, of how to split bark without splitting the tree, of how to move through the woods without leaving a single footprint behind. They were not meant to dominate nature, they were meant to live with it. In every stone blade, every bone needle, every coil of twine, there was not just survival, but understanding, harmony, a kind of intelligence that could not be taught in books or built in factories. Today, if you walk the banks of the Trinity River, you might still find remnants of that world. A broken spear point buried in the gravel, a basket fragment wedged beneath a rock, silent echoes of a time when survival wasn't bought, but earned. The tools have changed, but the hands still remember. Because in the Hooper Valley, the line between survival and memory has always been thin, and the valley never forgets. In the heart of the Hooper Valley, beneath towering redwoods and along the winding bend of the Trinity River, life moved not in years, but in cycles. The earth breathed in patterns, the rising of salmon, the falling of acorns, the slow turning of stars overhead. To the Hooper people, these patterns were not coincidences. They were instructions, signs, a sacred script written across the land in fog, fire, and water. And through ceremony, they answered. Each year, as the nights grew shorter and the river began to cool, the people gathered. Not in crowds, but in circles, in silence, in readiness. At the center stood the deerskin dance, one of the most sacred expressions of the Hooper spirit. It was not a performance. It was a petition, a living negotiation between the people and the powers that kept the world turning. The dancers, adorned in white deerskins, decorated with shells and sacred pigment, moved slowly, deliberately, not to impress, but to align. The regalia glistened with abalone and dentalium, their soft rattling like wind through dry grass. Each dancer carried an obsidian blade or a staff carved with prayer symbols. Every step, every gesture followed ancient rhythms, patterns held in memory, not written down. The dance could last for 10 days. Through heat, through rain, they moved, circling the sacred fire, eyes forward, minds anchored in the songs passed down from elders long buried in river mist. Songs that spoke of balance between man and land, between fire and water, between the seen and the unseen. Nearby, in the shadows of the lodge, elders murmured prayers over bowls of tobacco and feather bundles. The medicine men, the spiritual navigators of the tribe, watched the dancers not as judges, but as translators. Their job was not to interpret the performance, but to listen for imbalance. For a misstep, a cracked rhythm, a missed beat in the heartbeat of the world. Because these ceremonies were not for show, they were repair. The Hooper believed the universe had a center, not in the sky, not in distant mountains, but here, in this valley. And it could break if the ceremonies were not kept, if the songs were not sung, if the dancers forgot their lines, not of words, but of movement. The river might not run, the salmon might not return, the acorns might fall bitter and dry. Ceremony was not optional, it was survival. When the white deerskin ceremony was held, it was rarer, a ritual so sacred it was performed only when the tribe was in deep spiritual need. The white deer, almost mythic in its elusiveness, symbolized purity, clarity, a reawakening of the covenant between people and power. To hunt and capture a white deer without injury, without blood, required almost impossible skill. But to the Hooper, it was never just a hunt. It was a vision quest, a call answered. The deer had to present itself willingly to allow the taking. When the dancers moved through the village bearing the skin, it was held high on a staff, not worn, but honored. No one spoke as it passed. Children were hushed, even the trees seemed to fall silent. The skin caught the light like snow, like starlight. It was said that its spirit, if pleased, could wash away sickness, mend drought, or bring back lost salmon from the sea. It was not about spectacle. It was about harmony. Far from the dance grounds, deeper into the valley's folds, there were places where even the elders stepped lightly. Places thick with silence, with memory. There was the rock that hums, half buried in moss and ferns, where it's said the voices of the ancestors gather during storms. There was Fire Hollow, a pit ringed by stone, where no snow ever settled. A place believed to be the mouth of a great serpent spirit who guarded the boundary between worlds. And high on the northern ridge, a grove of blackened pines where lightning had struck 5 trees in one night, a sign, some said, that the sky spirits were angry. The Hooper never built near these places. They did not take from them. No wood, no water, no soil. Instead, they left offerings, twisted cords of tobacco, river stones stacked in threes, bits of carved shell. These were not acts of superstition, they were agreements. Because the land was not just terrain, it was spirit, and spirits needed to be heard. The medicine men, known to outsiders as shamans, were chosen by vision, not blood. They were marked early, children who spoke in dreams, who walked into fire and came out whole, who cried during thunderstorms for no reason. When such a child was born, the elders watched. If the signs persisted, the child was trained, not in secrecy, but in solitude. They were taught to fast for days in the woods, to drink only water from certain springs, to speak with animals in stillness. They learned the names of plants that healed fevers, plants that caused visions, plants that could bring death in the wrong hands, and they were taught how to enter the in-between. This was a state known only to the initiated, a waking dream, a spiritual crossing done through song, smoke, and pain. The medicine man would sit by the fire, eyes wide, body shaking, and speak in voices not his own. Sometimes he would chant, sometimes he would scream, sometimes he would fall silent for hours as if dead. When he returned, he brought back knowledge, a lost soul's name, a cure for a sick child, a warning of imbalance in the tribe's direction. These rituals were never doubted, not because of fear, but because they worked, and sometimes, in the worst of seasons, when the river ran dry or children stopped waking, the people would journey together to the high places. To the stone nest, a circle of rocks balanced so precisely that wind passed through them like a flute. Here, the tribe gathered in silence at sunset. No fire was lit, no food was eaten, only the hum of the wind, only the beat of the heart. They believed this place opened a path to the sky world, a place of spirits and memory, where ancestors watched with patient eyes. Here, they could ask for guidance, for forgiveness, for rain. There is a record, scratched into a cedar, plank now buried in the Hooper tribal archives, of a winter when 3 infants died in one moon cycle. The medicine man, an elder named Whitechpeck Tom, called the people to Stone Nest. He fasted for 7 days and returned with a message. The spirits were not angry, they were grieving. The people had stopped dancing, and so the deerskin dance was revived. In the snow, with bare feet, with cracked voices and hollow bellies, and the river rose. Ceremony was not superstition, it was the structure of their world, the breath between life and death, the line between hunger and harvest, the glue that held the visible and invisible together. And even now, centuries after the first settlers came, after the treaties, after the missions, after the silence, the dances return. Each year, as the fog lifts from the valley floor and the salmon begin their climb, the songs are heard again. Dancers step onto earth packed by the feet of their ancestors. Shells rattle, fires spark, and the spirits listen. Because in Hooper, the land remembers those who remember it, and the cycles of ceremony, of spirit, of survival continue. In the summer of 1849, the valley changed. It did not scream. It did not burn. Not at first. The change came quietly, on boots caked in red dust, with rifles slung across shoulders and the glint of gold fever in every eye. They came over the ridges in 2s and 3s, men from far-off cities, drawn by rumours of shining rivers and the promise of fortune. They brought picks, pans, and shovels. But they also brought hunger, guns, and a way of thinking the valley had never known. They saw the land as empty, a wilderness, unclaimed and ripe. To them, the river was not sacred, it was currency. The forests were not homes, they were lumber, and the people already living there were obstacles. The California gold rush had begun. To the Hooper, it was not a gold rush, it was a rupture. That fall, smoke rose from the western edge of the valley, not from ceremonial fires, but from the cookstoves of prospectors. Miners built shanties along the banks of the Trinity River. fouling the water with mercury and silt as they scraped for gold. Fish began to die. The once clear river turned cloudy. Salmon, confused by the change in the current, passed the valley by. One Hooper elder would later recall in an oral history, "The river spoke to us less. It flowed, but it no longer listened." Disease came next. Smallpox, measles, influenza, carried on boots and breath, invisible as smoke but deadlier than any musket. Within a single winter, entire families were gone. Children lost their grandparents. Mothers buried their sons. There were no cures in the medicine bundles for this kind of sickness. The shamans tried, but their chants were swallowed by silence. By 1851, settlers were pouring in by the hundreds. Not just miners, but surveyors, ranchers, men with paper maps and ink-stained hands. They carried deeds to land they had never seen, names on documents signed in cities far from the valley, treaties that gave away what could never be owned. In February of that year, representatives from the US government arrived with promises: food, shelter, peace. In exchange, the Hooper were to give up the vast stretch of their ancestral lands and accept confinement to a designated reservation. The ink was still wet when the betrayal began. The promised supplies never came. The boundaries drawn on paper bore no resemblance to the terrain. When the Hooper resisted, they were called hostile. When they defended themselves, they were called savages. Militias followed. They wore blue wool and polished brass. Some were soldiers. Others were volunteers, settlers deputized to clear the land. They marched with Springfield rifles, sabers, and cold instructions from distant capitals. Villages were burned, crops trampled, food stores destroyed. The old ways, the deer trails, the fire groves, the sacred stones, were desecrated without pause. The valley, once a living map of memory, was being erased. But the Hooper did not disappear. They adapted. They moved into the higher canyons, where the trees grew thicker and the fog never lifted. They abandoned large settlements and lived in smaller family groups, harder to track, harder to break. They built hidden caches for food, dug shelters into the earth, and passed messages between clans with silent runners moving by night. They learned to watch without being seen, to listen without reacting. They stopped setting fire to clear the land, knowing the smoke would give them away. The land grew wild again, tangled, dense, but it kept them safe. They had no cavalry, no government to plead to, but they had memory, they had the songs. In 1864, the US government established the Hooper Valley Indian Reservation, one of the few created directly on the tribe's ancestral land. On paper, it was a concession. In reality, it was a containment. Fences were built. A military fort was constructed near the river's bend. Officers with clean boots and polished buttons watched over a people whose world had narrowed to a fraction of what it once was. Children were taken, sent to mission schools where their language was forbidden, their hair cut, their traditions labelled evil. They returned speaking English, afraid to dance, ashamed of their names. But not all forgot. There is a journal, weathered, brittle, held in a museum archive, written by a settler woman named Eliza Graham, who came to the valley with her husband in 1868. She wrote, "They do not look at us, they do not speak unless we ask. But in the woods, I've seen them watching, always watching." The Hooper resisted not with open war, but with endurance. They kept their stories in baskets, their medicine in plants, their knowledge in silence. The old dances were moved indoors, performed at night, in whispers and steps muffled by earth floors. Songs that once echoed through the valley now hummed behind closed doors. They refused to vanish. In the spring of 1871, a militia patrol vanished in the hills north of the valley. Their bodies were never found. The official report blamed weather. Locals whispered of silent arrows. No one ever claimed credit. The Hooper said nothing. They survived by waiting, by hiding their power until it was safe to show it again. When the government sent surveyors in the 1880s to lay roads, they found markers missing. Paths that twisted without reason. Trails that ended in thickets of thorns. No one offered help. No one offered warning. The land itself resisted, as if the valley remembered. It is said that in those years, the valley grieved. Not loud, not fast, but deeply. The trees grew taller. The river slowed. The stones warmed slower in the sun. The old spirits had not been banished. They had been wounded. And like the people who spoke to them, they waited. And in time, the ceremonies returned. Slowly, cautiously, the dances were performed again. Children once hidden from the missionaries were taught the old songs by their grandparents. The white deerskin, once buried beneath fear, was raised again in offering. The fire pits were rekindled. The medicine was passed in whispers. They had survived. Today, the Hoopa still live in the valley that bears their name, against all odds, against war, paper, plague, and forgetting. They walk the same trails, fish the same river, tell the same stories, altered by time, but not erased. The scars remain. The broken promises are not forgotten, but the people remain. Because in the end, the greatest resistance was not war. It was memory. It was staying. The settlers came for gold. The Hoopa stayed for everything else. And the valley, old, wounded, sacred, still remembers them. In the far northern reaches of California, where mist clings to the treetops and the land rolls in waves of forested ridges, a quiet war unfolded. A war not marked by columns and flags, but by shadows in the pines, by blood on moss, and by footsteps that left no trace. It began in 1858, 5 years after the gold rush turned the rivers toxic and the treaties to ash. The white men called it the Bald Hills War, a name that made it sound like a dispute over land or cattle. But to the Hoopa and the neighbouring Chilula and Wilcott, it was something far older, a war for survival. It was not fought in open fields. There were no drums, no battle lines. It was a war waged in fog, in ambush, in silence. The US Army marched into the hills, believing they could crush resistance with numbers and firepower. But they were strangers to this land, and the land made no room for strangers. The Hoopa knew these ridges like breath, every ravine, every deer trail, every moss-covered rock. They moved not as soldiers, but as smoke, slipping between tree trunks, vanishing into fern-covered ravines, reappearing miles away. The mountains were not obstacles, they were allies. By day, US patrols struggled through thick undergrowth and punishing inclines, burdened by heavy packs, uniforms soaked in rain, boots that blistered and split. The fog never lifted, rifles jammed, men stumbled, and always, just beyond sight, movement. An arrow from the trees, a trap sprung in the path, a figure glimpsed on a ridge only to vanish before the shot. One lieutenant wrote in his journal, "It is not war as we understand it. It is chasing ghosts. The trees whisper their warnings, and by the time we raise our rifles, the forest is silent again." The Hoopa did not fight to win. They fought to endure. They knew they could not match the army in firepower. They had no cannons, no endless supply lines. But they had terrain, they had time, and they had memory. In the Bald Hills, the land itself became a weapon. Narrow trails were seeded with sharpened stakes. Creek crossings were guarded by scouts who signaled with bird calls. Hidden caches of dried acorn meal and smoked salmon allowed warriors to vanish for weeks without returning home. At night, Hoopa families buried embers in hollowed logs to keep warm without revealing their fires. Children were trained not to cry. The elderly moved without complaint. Silence was survival, and in the shadows, strategy was born. One Hoopa war leader, known in settler accounts only as Yellow Elk, led a band that struck along the edges of settler supply lines, never in the same place twice. He used false trails, deadfall traps, and decoys to confuse pursuit. When the soldiers chased him into a canyon, they found it empty, but the ridges above were not. Rocks, arrows, fire. In minutes, what was meant to be a decisive capture turned into a rout. The army responded with rage. They called it scorched earth, a tactic meant to starve resistance into submission. Troops burned homes, smashed food stores, felled groves of hazel and oak. They took women and children captive, marched them south to reservations where disease and hunger finished what the bullets did not. But every village burned sparked another resistance cell deeper in the hills. Every tree felled whispered a warning through the roots. By the winter of 1860, the army had built Fort Gaston in the heart of the valley. They believed the Hooper were cornered. But even as the flag rose over the barracks, the forests stirred with unseen movement. In early spring, snow still heavy on the high passes, a supply wagon left the fort on its usual route. It never returned. Days later, scouts found the wreckage, wheels shattered, mules gone, no sign of the men. Only a single arrow, driven deep into the trunk of a redwood, pointing east. The army doubled its patrols, but the Hooper had already shifted. They had no need to hold ground. Their goal was not territory, it was freedom, it was time. They slowed the war, stretched it, turned it into erosion, a constant grinding pressure that wore down the soldiers' morale, their maps, their sense of victory. In the summer of 1862, with federal troops stretched thin by the Civil War back east, California volunteers replaced the regulars. Many were miners and settlers turned soldiers, men with personal grudges and little patience. Their tactics grew more brutal. Entire villages were emptied, livestock slaughtered, water sources poisoned. But even these efforts could not crush what the Hooper carried in their blood. Because this war was not just for land, it was for identity, for memory. The Hooper passed down their resistance in lullabies, in carved symbols on cave walls, in caches of obsidian arrowheads buried near sacred sites. Every child born during the war was given a name that held meaning. River that waits, fog of return, silent fire. Even as mothers wept, even as elders whispered of hunger, the people did not forget who they were. The army began to break. One sergeant wrote home, "The woods never sleep. There is no glory here, just cold and silence and the feeling that we are not welcome." By 1864, the war began to fade, not with a treaty, but with exhaustion. The army claimed victory, the newspapers printed triumph. But no celebration came from the hills. The Hooper returned to the valley, not defeated but altered. Their population had been halved, their land fractured, their way of life scarred. But they were still there. And in the years that followed, they rebuilt. Slowly, patiently, the same way they had fought. One fire, one song, one memory at a time. They reopened the dance grounds, sang the old songs, re-walked the trails that had saved them. The forest grew back. The river, slowly, began to listen again. And deep in the bald hills, where moss grows thick and sunlight filters through redwood needles, there are still places untouched by time. Places where arrowheads lie buried in earth, where trees bear the scars of old watchposts, where silence is not emptiness, but memory. The war is long over, but the land remembers, and so do the people, because the bald hills did not belong to the United States Army. They belonged to those who knew how to disappear, and how to survive. The river had seen it all, long before boots churned its shores into silt, long before treaties turned memory into ink, before the sound of axes broke the rhythm of birdsong, before the redwoods were felled and fire was stolen from the groves. It had seen the first songs, the first smoke from the first homes. It had held the feet of children who would one day become elders. It had carried salmon upriver like an offering. And when everything else was taken, when the world shrank to borders and barbed wire, the river remained. It did not forget. Not when the ceremonies were outlawed. Not when the children were sent away in wagons with mission names on their lips. Not even when the soldiers raised their fort near the bend where healing stones once lay. The Hooper could not speak their language in school. They could not dance in public. They could not gather around fires in the way their grandfathers had. But the river didn't ask for permission. It still ran. It still remembered the old paths, the depth of the salmon pools, the feel of prayer-stained stones beneath its surface. And in its constant motion, the people found stillness, refuge, a kind of quiet resistance. At dawn, Hooper women moved along the riverbank with baskets on their backs, gathering willow shoots, hazel branches, bear grass. Not loudly, not in protest, but in preservation. They wove baskets not only for harvest or ceremony, but for memory. A certain knot, passed from mother to daughter, told of a flood that once washed away 3 villages. A spiral pattern mapped the bends of the Trinity. The base of a basket, tight and flat, mirrored the smoke hole of an earth lodge buried long ago. Each strand was a sentence, each loop a prayer. The baskets could hold water and history. Even when missionaries demanded that Hooper women cease their weaving, claiming the patterns held pagan spells, they did not stop. They simply adapted. Some weavings grew smaller, more compact. Others were framed as art, sold at trade posts to passing tourists. But always, hidden within the reeds, were the maps, the names, the memory. One elder, Sarah Wailaki, known among her people as Tsunga, meaning she who binds the river, continued weaving into her 90s. Her hands twisted through pain and age, but never forgot the rhythm. She buried baskets along the riverbank, filled with dried salmon bones, feathers, shards of obsidian, offerings to a future she would never see. The river was her witness. By the 1920s, dam projects and logging upstream had begun to choke the Trinity's flow. Salmon runs dwindled. The river grew quieter, thinner. But the Hooper knew silence. They had learned how to survive in it, and some began to speak again. In the dark corners of smokehouses and tucked behind churches, stories were told in whispers. Elders spoke of a time when the salmon would return if the people remembered how to greet them, not with nets or guns, but with song. In 1936, a small group of Hooper families gathered by the river under the cover of dusk. They lit a fire, low, so the smoke wouldn't rise above the trees. A drum began, then a voice, then 2, and then a dance. For the first time in decades, the river heard its name spoken in ceremony. They called it a family gathering. But those who were there knew better. It was an awakening, not a protest, a return. By the 1950s, as federal Indian policy shifted toward termination and relocation, another threat loomed. The government declared plans to move native families into cities, away from the land, away from the river. It promised jobs, housing, opportunity. But the cost was clear: disconnection. Some left, some never returned. But those who stayed dug in deeper. They taught the children how to walk barefoot in the shallows without disturbing the silt, how to read cloud patterns before a flood, how to trap eel with nothing but a stone basket, and patience. The river became a school. It taught what books would not. By the 1970s, Hooper activists, descendants of warriors and weavers, began to organize. They marched not in rage, but in memory. They held signs with salmon painted in red clay. They spoke of ecological rights, of water flows, of treaty promises long ignored. But beneath the legal arguments was something older, a whisper that had never died. This land knows us, this river remembers us, and we will not leave. That decade, restoration projects began. Hooper biologists worked alongside elders to monitor salmon runs. They rebuilt stone weirs in the old style, redirecting water with nothing but stacked rock and ancestral geometry. They hand-carved redwood canoes, not for show, for use. Children who once sat in English-only classrooms now stood knee-deep in the river, learning the songs of returning salmon. They cleaned fish with obsidian blades. They learned the prayer for the first catch, whispered, not shouted. One boy, just 7 years old, dipped his hands into the river, after placing an offering of tobacco leaves. His grandmother, blind from age but sharp in spirit, stood beside him and said, "You do not need to see the fish. You just need to remember how to welcome them." And in time, they came. Salmon, long absent from the high reaches of the Trinity, began to return in small numbers. Not enough for celebration, but enough for hope. Enough to remind the people that the river, though wounded, still listened. And today, it still runs. It runs beside homes rebuilt, schools where the Hooper language is taught again, dance grounds reopened, fires rekindled, baskets unburied. The scars are still there, in the land, in the stories, in the silence between generations. But so is the current, moving forward, carrying the memory of those who sang in secret, who danced in shadows, who wove the river into every strand of their resistance. Because the Trinity was never just water. It was voice, and it never stopped speaking, even when no one was listening. By the final years of the 19th century, the rifle had quieted. The cavalry patrols had thinned. The forts, once booming with soldiers and commands, stood cold in their silence. The wars were declared over. Treaties had been signed, reservations drawn, and names catalogued into government ledgers. But the battle was far from done. It had simply changed shape. Now the battlefield was the mind, the weapon was forgetting, and the targets were children. In 1887, the US Congress passed the Dawes Act, a law that split native lands into private parcels and sold the rest to settlers. What wasn't taken by force was now dissolved by paper. Communal memory fractured into isolated plots. The Hooper, like so many others, were told they would become citizens if they gave up who they were. Around the same time, another edict spread across the reservations: education, but not in the language of the valley, not under the trees, not with story or song. Federal boarding schools opened their gates, far from home, and began pulling native children away, sometimes with promises, sometimes with threats, often with both. The journey from Hooper to the nearest government school was long, overland by wagon, then train, then silence. Children arrived in rows, stripped of their names, their hair cut short, their moccasins taken, replaced by stiff leather shoes and wool uniforms that smelled of mildew and punishment. They were forbidden to speak their language, forbidden to dance, forbidden to remember. Punishment was swift: isolation, hard labor, starvation. One Hooper child wrote in a torn corner of a schoolbook, "I spoke once. They beat me. I said nothing the next time. Only the wind could hear my words." Teachers called it progress. Parents called it loss. But the people, they called it war. Back home, mothers wept without sound. Fathers carved small effigies of their children into alderwood and placed them near the fire. Every sunrise, families stood by the river and prayed, not for rebellion, for return. But something was stirring. In the winter of 1889, a Paiute prophet named Wovoka began to speak of visions, dreams where the old world returned, where buffalo ran free, where ancestors walked beside the living again, where sorrow had an end. He called it the ghost dance. It spread like fire through dry grass, from Nevada to the plains, to the mountains of Oregon, and into the valleys of Northern California, among the Yurok, the Kurok, and finally, the Hooper. The dance was circular, slow, repetitive. It summoned the ancestors. It defied erasure. It promised that the white man's world would collapse and the land would be reborn. It was not war, it was a prayer. But to the US government, it was rebellion, a threat. Officials banned the dance. Armed patrols were sent to reservations. Dancers were arrested. In 1890, at Wounded Knee, the army opened fire on a Lakota ghost dance camp, killing hundreds: men, women, children. But the Hooper danced anyway, in secret, at night, in clearings far from the reservation agent's office, where the trees stood thick, and the stars remembered the old names. They painted their faces in ash. They sang the old songs beneath their breath. They danced barefoot, calling to their grandfathers, to the salmon, to the fire. One elder said, "We danced so that our shadows would not vanish." It was not revolution. It was survival. Back at the schools, children began passing notes, lines of song written phonetically in English to keep the cadence alive. Girls whispered basket patterns into each other's ears. Boys traced the shapes of mountain trails into their knees beneath stiff desks. They rebelled not with fists, but with memory. Every story told after lights out was an act of resistance. Every name remembered in silence was a flame the agents could not extinguish. There is a photograph, taken in 1892, of Hooper children lined up in stiff collars and dark suits, eyes blank, hands clasped. But if you look close, you see one boy's moccasins peeking out beneath his trousers. Worn smooth, stitched by hand. He had smuggled them back into school after a holiday visit home. He wore them as armor. He was not alone. Women back in the valley became the keepers. Not just of food, but of language, of rhythm, of truth. They trained their memories like tools, sharp, precise, secret. They wove the creation stories into the baskets. They buried song sticks beneath cedar roots. They taught prayers to toddlers too young to understand what they meant, knowing they would grow into the meaning one day. And still, they danced. Sometimes just in their hearts. Sometimes in full moonlight, when the wind was strong and the risk less. And always, the river watched. By the early 1900s, some schools began to close. Policies shifted, not out of mercy, but because they hadn't worked. The children still remembered. They had not become white. They had become quiet. Quiet like the forest before a storm. Quiet like the fire that refuses to die. And now, the Hooper stand where their ancestors once danced in secret. They sing openly. They teach the language in schools built on their own land. The baskets are no longer hidden. They are displayed, passed proudly from hand to hand. Children once shamed for their heritage now wear it painted across their cheeks at sunrise ceremonies. But they have not forgotten. They know that survival did not come from violence alone. It came from grandmothers who spoke in hushed tones beside the fire, from fathers who taught the old words through stories disguised as lullabies, from the ghost dancers who moved beneath the trees, their footprints echoing a promise that the world could be made whole again. They survived not because they fought, but because they remembered. Because when the guns fell silent, the stories kept speaking, and the ghosts never left. In the winter of 1891, the Hooper people gathered their hopes and walked them into a room full of suits, brass buttons, and the scent of burning coal. They had survived war, survived disease, survived the theft of language, of land, of children. And now, at last, they were told the government wanted peace. Not with rifles this time, but with paper. The treaty they were offered bore the promise of recognition, of protection, of land finally secured by ink rather than blood. The Hooper elders approached the negotiation table in solemn silence. They wore their best regalia, otter pelts draped across shoulders, necklaces of dentalium shells strung with generations of memory. They did not speak first. That was not their way. Across from them sat men with pens and ledgers, flanked by soldiers whose hands rested on their belts. Interpreters turned Hooper words into clipped English phrases, flattening meaning with every syllable lost in translation. But still, the elders spoke. They spoke of the Trinity River, of how it was not a boundary, but a spine. They spoke of the land, not as a possession, but as a relation. They spoke of ceremony, of harvest, of their dead. And they asked for one thing, that their homeland, this valley of fog and fire, remain theirs, not as a favor, as a truth. The treaty offered promises. It laid out the borders of what would become the Hooper Valley Reservation. It promised hunting and fishing rights, promised federal protection, promised peace, and so the Hooper signed. They left their marks with trust, not in the men across the table, but in the sanctity of spoken word. Among their people, a promise was sacred. It was as binding as bone, as deep as blood. But in Washington, the treaty met silence. Congress never ratified it. No vote, no debate, just quiet shelving, a quiet betrayal. The ink had dried, but the promise was never alive. For the Hooper, this was not the first broken word, but it cut differently, deeper, because this time they had spoken not with weapons, but with reason. They had believed that survival might finally take a new shape, one that didn't require hiding or hunger or hiding their culture in whispers. The treaty that never was would not be the last. In the decades that followed, more land was carved away. Resource rights dissolved. Even the river, the very heart of the valley, was regulated, diverted, studied, but never heard. One Hooper elder, Thomas Rekwa, wrote in a personal letter preserved in fragments. They said we would be safe, that no more soldiers would come, that our land was ours now, but the trees are still falling, the water still burns the tongue, the promises have no names behind them. And so the Hooper turned inward again, not in surrender, but in strategy. They began to document, to gather affidavits, to keep ledgers of their own, names, dates, maps, stories. If the government would not keep its promise, the people would keep the proof. Families stored copies of the treaty in cedar chests wrapped in buckskin. Elders carried translations folded into prayer bundles. Every generation was told the story, not just of the treaty, but of its silence, and of the choice to endure anyway. Because survival now was not only in the forest or the fire, it was in memory, in record, in the refusal to forget. One woman, Eliza Chimal, became known as the keeper of names. She walked from village to village with a ledger in hand, recording the births, marriages, and land use of every Hooper family. When asked why, she said, "Because one day they'll say we weren't here, and this book will whisper back that we were." She lived to see her children become elders themselves, and the book passed through their hands, each one adding their thread to the tapestry. The betrayal of 1891 did not break the Hooper. It steeled them. It taught them the limits of negotiation and the power of community. They knew the land would never sign a treaty. It didn't need to. It had already claimed them. In later years, government agents would visit, flashing maps and policies and inspection reports. They'd ask why the Hooper still fished in closed waters, still gathered herbs on protected hillsides, still spoke in a language that had not been approved. The Hooper would answer the same way every time. "We signed your treaty. You did not. No weapon, just truth, just the quiet weight of history." In time, the missing treaty became a symbol, not of failure, but of endurance. In courtrooms, it was cited as evidence of unjust treatment. In classrooms, it was used to teach new generations how to read between the lines. And in ceremonies, the story was told with pride, not of defeat, but of patience. Because some victories do not wear feathers or medals. Some victories are a boy learning the river songs from his grandmother, a basket pattern passed down in silence, a line in a ledger that refuses to fade, and a people who never left, even when the paper said they had. The Treaty of 1891 never became law, but the land remembers, and so do the Hooper. Because survival is not always about fire and steel. Sometimes it's about ink, and what you do when it dries into nothing. In the long shadow of silence, something began to stir, not loudly, not all at once, but like moss creeping over a stone, steady, soft, unstoppable. For nearly a century the Hooper people had endured, not through war, but through memory, through the slow defiance of breath, of presence, of simply remaining when the world around them said they should vanish. Now, in the fractured light of the 20th century, they began to do something bolder. They began to return, not to the land they had never left, but to the sacred ways that had been forced underground. Songs sung only in whispers now rose into the canopy. Dances that had once drawn punishment now shaped the soil beneath bare feet. Words that had nearly vanished were spoken again in full sentences. This was not nostalgia, it was reclamation. In the 1950s, tribal elders gathered around smoky hearths and folding chairs, no longer warriors, but architects of memory. Some of them had grown up under federal boarding schools, their tongues punished for speaking their own language. Now, with grandchildren sitting at their knees, they began to reverse the damage. One of them, Lena Marshall, stood before a group of Hooper youth in a makeshift classroom, a converted storage room in the tribal center, and said, "They stole our words so they could steal our land. But if we bring back the words, maybe we bring back the rest." She opened a worn notebook filled with hand-scribbled translations, words for fire, water, ash, moon. Not just nouns, living things. Things that had names before English tried to take them away. One by one, the students repeated the sounds. Halking, salmon, enter, heart, miwa, dance. Words that had slept in the blood of the valley now took shape again in breath. And with the language came the ceremonies. At first, they were quiet affairs. A handful of elders and curious youth gathered beside the Trinity River to light a ceremonial fire. The wood crackled like a voice returning after long illness. Smoke rose into the trees like an offering. No uniforms, no banners, just memory. Then came the deerskin dance, once outlawed, once driven into hiding, now returned, not as a reenactment, but as a living ritual. The regalia was pieced together from memory and scraps, dentalium shell strands retrieved from trunks buried decades earlier, dance sticks carved by grandfathers who had never gotten to dance themselves. Young men stepped into the circle with faces painted in earth. Young women sang from their chests, voices trembling with reverence and fear, not fear of failure, but of forgetting again. They danced for the ancestors, for the ones who had danced in silence, for the ones who had never stopped dreaming of this moment. And when the final drumbeat faded, the circle didn't break, it grew. By the 1970s, the Hooper were not only reclaiming ceremony, they were fighting for the legal ground it stood on. When the federal government proposed further timber sales on sacred Hooper land, the tribe filed suit, not with arrows, with affidavits, with maps marked in red ochre, with oral history entered into legal record. It wasn't just a fight for trees, it was a fight for memory, for the places where medicine men once fasted for visions, for the ridgelines where the old ones said the spirit moved strongest, for the river bends where the salmon were once welcomed with chant and fire. In one courtroom, an elder testified in both English and Hooper, letting the judge hear the cadence of a language older than any flag. He held up a basket woven by his mother and said, "This is not art, this is a map, a memory, a right." And slowly, the law began to listen. Not perfectly, not fully, but doors once closed began to crack. Language classes were funded, cultural centers built. The white deerskin ceremony, once banned, was danced openly again under a full moon that seemed to shine just a little brighter. And still, the fire circles grew. Children once taught only English in federal schools now learned to introduce themselves in Hooper. Not just names, but clan, river, purpose. Language no longer separated them from their past. It became the bridge to it. At funerals, old songs returned. At births, old prayers were spoken again. In kitchens, grandmothers hummed lullabies that hadn't been sung aloud since their own childhoods. And at every turn, the elders led. Elders who had endured punishment for speaking the language now became its teachers. Elders who had seen ceremonies vanish now lit the first match. They taught not just the forms, but the feeling, the why behind every dance step, the silence before every drumbeat. Because this wasn't just about revival, it was about return, a return to relationship. with the land, with spirit, with one another. In one valley schoolhouse, a young boy named Eli stood before his class and recited a prayer in Hooper. Not from memory, from meaning. He had learned it from his great-grandmother, who had learned it from hers, who had once whispered it into fire so that the words would not die. When he finished, the class fell silent. The teacher, herself a boarding school survivor, wiped a tear from her cheek. She didn't need to explain what had just happened. Everyone in that room already knew. The land knew too. The salmon began returning in stronger numbers. The water, once polluted, ran clearer in the tributaries. Fire was used again for stewardship, just as it had been for generations before the practice was criminalized. The land had not forgotten how to respond to care. It just needed the care to return. And now, as smoke curls into the early morning sky once more, not from destruction, but from ceremony, the valley breathes. It breathes in rhythm with the drums. It breathes in the language returned. It breathes in the stories no longer buried, but spoken aloud under sun and sky. This is not the end of the Hooper story. It is not even the beginning. It is a continuation, a reclamation, of songs, of sovereignty, of soul. Because what was stolen has not been lost. Not when it still lives in the voice of a child, in the rhythm of a dance, in the soft glow of sacred fire reborn. The Hooper did not just survive, they remembered how to rise. In a time when the world fears fire, the Hooper walk into it, not with fear, but with reverence, because for them, fire has never been an enemy. It has always been a teacher, fierce, wild, necessary. And now, in the face of a planet burning beyond control, the old ways have become the new frontier. They call it fire as medicine, but to understand that, you must first understand what fire meant long before helicopters dropped slurry, before sirens screamed through the hills, before smoke maps colored the news. For thousands of years, the Hooper people lit the land on purpose, not to destroy, but to heal. They burned the underbrush to clear pathways for deer. They burned the hillsides to coax wild berries into bloom. They burned the forest floor to renew the soil, so the roots of oak and hazel could stretch deep and wide. They called it cultural burning, a sacred relationship between flame and earth. Fire wasn't random, it was rhythmic, a cycle, a covenant. But when colonists came, that covenant was broken. The government outlawed cultural burning by the early 20th century. They said it was dangerous, primitive, a risk to property. In its place came suppression, a belief that all fire was bad and that the best flame was a dead one. For decades, that belief held. The forests grew thick, the fuels stacked high. The land, once cleansed regularly by small intentional burns, became a powder keg waiting for a spark. And the spark came. In recent years, megafires have turned the West into a cauldron. Wind-driven infernos torch hundreds of thousands of acres in days. Forests that once danced with low flames now explode in heat too fierce even for the trees to survive. Species vanish, watersheds burn, homes fall to ash, and suddenly the world started looking back at what had been ignored, back to the people who had always known how to burn, back to the Hooper. Today, in the heart of Hooper Valley, a new generation of firekeepers walks in the footsteps of their ancestors, holding drip torches instead of flint, but guided by the same intention. One of them is Noah Gensaw, a quiet man with calloused hands and a calm voice. He walks the line in a yellow Nomex suit, but beneath the gear is an old rhythm. Before each burn, he lays tobacco on the earth. He speaks to the fire, not as a servant, but as a cousin, a relative to be honored and respected. Fire listens, he says. If you treat it right, it'll feed you. If you turn your back, it'll teach you. The Hooper burn with precision, in narrow bands, along creek beds, across ridge lines. They read the wind, the slope, the moisture in the moss. They don't just light, they wait. They watch. They speak in signals that modern agencies are only now learning to understand. But the results speak louder than words. In areas treated with cultural burns, plant life rebounds stronger. Wildlife returns. Oak trees, long choked by fir and brush, stretch back into the sky. Traditional foods like Tanowak acorns, hazel shoots for basketry, and bear grass for regalia come back in abundance. Fire doesn't erase the land, it reveals it. And still, the old resistance remains. Bureaucracy, permits, red tape. Some agencies still see indigenous burning as a risk, even as their own methods fail to stem the rise of infernos. But the tide is turning. Science is catching up to tradition. Ecologists now confirm what native people have said all along, that fire exclusion is not safety, but a recipe for disaster. That controlled, low-intensity burns are the only way to reset the ecological clock. That you cannot fight fire by fear alone. And so, collaboration begins. The Hooper Valley tribe partners with universities, with fire councils, with state forestry agencies, not as subjects, but as teachers. Workshops are held in the valley. Students in lab coats walk beside grandmothers who carry flint in their pouches. Federal fire crews listen to tribal elders explain when the manzanita is dry enough to light, or how the fog tells you when to hold back. The knowledge passed from hand to hand over centuries now finds its way into field guides and climate strategies. One elder says, "They told us to stop burning. Then the world caught fire. Now they ask us how to light again." And still, the Hooper burn. Every flame lit is a prayer, a memory rekindled, a future shaped by flame. Not a future of destruction, but of balance, of meadows reborn, of salmon runs nourished by cool, clean streams, of forests not smothered, but breathing again. The children learn early. They walk the burn lines with their uncles, their aunties, their teachers. They learn how to build a fire with cedar bark and slow breath, how to smell the change in the wind, how to hear the pop of sap in the branches, and know when it's time to pull back. They don't fear the fire. They respect it, because they see what it brings. They see the berries returning to the hillside, the elk tracks pressed fresh into cooled ash, the eagle nesting high in a pine that was nearly lost to choking growth. And they see themselves, part of the cycle, not outside it. This is not just fire management. It is cultural restoration. It is survival, not in crisis, but in rhythm. Because the Hooper have always known that to live on this land, you must live with the fire. You must invite it. You must listen to its lessons. And when it comes, you do not run. You stand. You guide. You remember. Because fire is not the end. It is the beginning. A spark that rises from ash and burns with purpose. There are places in this world where time does not forget, where every stone remembers its shaping and every tree tells stories in the hush of wind, where the river doesn't just flow, it listens. Hooper Valley is one of those places, a land carved by water, raised by fire, and held in the arms of a people who never let go. It is easy, in history, to talk about what was lost, to linger on the broken treaties, the vanished languages, the children taken from homes that smelled of cedar and firewood, to count the wounds by their depth, by the years they stayed open. But this story, this valley, was never just about loss. It has always been about endurance. Even now, when the sun lifts across the ridgelines and lays its gold across the river, the valley still breathes, not as a monument, but as a living memory. It breathes through the voices of elders who rise before dawn to bless the water, through the laughter of children learning words their grandparents once whispered in secret, through the smoke of a ceremonial fire, curling upward like a prayer made visible. We return to the river, always the river. Its banks have shifted, its depth has changed, but its current still moves to the rhythm of ancient songs, songs that rose from the mouths of dancers clad in white deerskin and shell, long before asphalt roads ever crack this soil. Listen closely, and you can hear them still. A low drum echoing against the canyon walls, a chant that bends the air, full of longing, full of remembering. The Hooper people never left. They were hunted, displaced, silenced, but they did not vanish. They remained, sometimes underground, sometimes in shadows, sometimes in story, alone. But always, always, they remained. And now, their breath fills the valley again, in classrooms where elders teach children to speak in the tones of the river, in fire camps where cultural burns reclaim the land from neglect, in longhouses where old dances rise like dawn from the ashes of time. The valley, too, remembers. It blooms in places where fire walked carefully through brush. It shivers with wind that carries the scent of moss and pine. It shelters the same deer trails followed by generations of hunters who walked barefoot, their silence part of the ritual. Some say land is just geography, but to the Hooper, land is kin. It is not owned, it is honored. It gives, and is given to. This is why they fight for it. Not out of ownership, but out of love. Love born not in comfort, but in grit, in cold rivers and empty winters, in cedar smoke and burned fingers, in the slow rebuilding of songs once outlawed. This story does not end in despair. It ends, like the river, by continuing. There are still challenges, climate change, policy battles, economic pressures that threaten to pull tradition into silence once again. But there is also momentum. There are Hooper youth returning home from college not to leave the valley, but to serve it. There are language apps loaded on smartphones filled with Hooper words, a digital fire to light the path forward. There are elders in council meetings, not to ask permission, but to declare vision. There are hands weaving baskets that will carry not only acorns but memory, and in the middle of it all, there is the land, unfolding its arms, lifting its fog, and letting the people back into the rhythm they were never meant to leave. In the final shot, the camera rises high, showing the full sweep of the valley, the mountains holding it close like ribs around a heart. And the narration falls to quiet. Only the river speaks now. A hush, a breath, a promise. This is not just the story of a place. It is the story of how place and people refuse to be torn apart. Hooper Valley endures, and because it does, so do its people. In ceremony, in sovereignty, in silence and in sound, the valley still breathes. And we, at last, are listening. The wind before borders did not carry names, only scent of pine sap, ash bark, and the musk of deer trails worn deep into the soil by centuries of motion. Before Montana was ever carved into maps or whispered in treaty rooms, there were people who walked with the land as kin. They did not own it. They answered to it. They were Anishinaabe. From the birch-covered lakes of what would one day be called Minnesota and Ontario, they moved not in conquest, but in rhythm. Westward, along rivers that shone like wet veins beneath a ceiling of sky and spruce. Their migration in the early 1700s wasn't sparked by gold or war, but by hunger, encroachment, and the pull of ancestral visions. Prophets spoke of a place where food grew on water, menumin, wild rice, that sacred grain, and where the spirit would be stronger in the open spaces beyond the tightening clasp of colonial presence. But that journey was not straight, and it was never safe. Winters came earlier in those days, it seemed. Snow climbed high into the treetops, and the ice on rivers thickened before the geese could return. Entire families carried their homes on sleds, fashioned from curved willow and sinew. Children's cheeks, red from frostbite, bore no complaint. The old ones sang into the wind, voices carried in a language older than the stars. These were not people of the map, not yet. They were people of memory and of flame. Their tools were simple. An obsidian blade, honed from riverstone and lashed to carved antler, could clean a beaver in minutes. Traps were laid by hand, baited with dried fish or the scent of rendered fat. Snowshoes of rawhide let them walk where the bison herds had fled. Bows of black ash, steamed and bent, were passed down through generations, each bearing the notches of deer taken and feasts secured. And always the stories were carried, even when the bodies failed. The tale of the boy who became a bear, the girl who turned into wind to save her village, the flood that ended the First World. They moved through what the French voyageurs called la grande silence, the vast hush of pine and frozen lakes, and into that hush the Métis were born. From unions between Anishinaabe women and French fur traders emerged children of two tongues, daughters who tanned hides with cedar ash and spoke both Cree and French prayers, sons who could read a sky for weather or a white man for lies. These were not half people. They were whole nations unto themselves, wheelwrights, canoe makers, and translators who held the fragile threads of two worlds. Among them, a lineage began that would later take the name Little Shell. Before the man himself, before Ayabewe Witung would lead his people into history's dark mouth, the roots of that name were forming in sweat lodges and winter camps. They gathered near Turtle Mountain, not far from the Dakotas, but their hearts still remembered the rice lakes and maple groves of the old homeland. In stories, they spoke of firelight flickering against bark lodges, of loons calling across water like mourning songs. Even as their trails lengthened westward, they never walked alone. Spirits moved beside them, ancestors whose bones fed the forests, whose names were sung over boiling pots of rabbit and squirrel. And so when trouble came, when the world began to shift under the weight of strangers and steel, the Anishinaabe did not tremble. They watched. They remembered. By 1740, the fur trade had become a hungry beast. French and English traders, competing for pelts and dominance, had begun to see native tribes not as sovereign nations, but as levers, allies, tools, or obstacles. The Anishinaabe, once respected for their fierce independence, now found themselves drawn into conflicts not of their making. Rumors of gunpowder and land claims whispered through the forests like disease. But still they moved, still they survived. A Little Shell elder would later say, "We did not flee. We followed the roots, even when they led into darkness. The darkness was coming. But in these years, in the deep woods and high plains, the people still danced. They still hunted elk with spears carved from ash. They painted their lodges with ochre and bear fat. Ceremonies continued under stars so clear they looked like frost on the backs of buffalo. Children were born beneath the howl of wolves and the heartbeat of drums. And the West, as we now call it, was not yet taken. It was known in a different way, by breath and bone, by the curve of a ridge where berries grew fat in summer, by the cry of a hawk whose path foretold storms, by the sound snow makes when it falls on pine. This was not wilderness to them. It was a grandmother, a teacher, a body they fed, honored, and died within. By the 1760s, the Little Shell ancestors had established themselves as formidable scouts and guides. They knew how to bend the land without breaking it, how to live alongside buffalo without driving them to ruin. Their presence grew quieter but deeper, like roots below a winter prairie, unseen but alive. And it was in this quiet, in this fog before history drew its cruel lines, that something sacred persisted. A nation without a border, a people without a capital, but not without law. Their law was reciprocity, their economy was generosity, and their survival was not merely a feat of bushcraft, though that was legendary. It was a matter of faith. Faith in the land, in kin, in stories. A trail of fog and fire. That's what the journey westward became. Fog, because so much was unknown. And fire, because they carried it in their hearts, in their food, in the coals they tucked into hollow logs to keep the next night warm. Fire that remembered. Fire that would one day speak through a man named Little Shell. But already, it was burning. In the next century, that fire would be tested. It would be surrounded, outlawed, forgotten, and buried. But it would never be extinguished. Because it wasn't just fire. It was memory. And memory, as the Anishinaabe knew, is what keeps a people from vanishing. Even when the world insists they are already gone. In the early morning silence, before the frost had melted from the red willow branches, a boy knelt by the riverbank with a net of sinew strung between two slender poles. The mist was still thick on the water. Above him, the black spruce stood like sentinels. The only sound was the quiet drip of last night's thaw and the low, steady hum of his mother's voice inside the birch-bark shelter just up the slope. This was not just a boy, and this was not just a river. This was Turtle Mountain country. And the boy was Métis. His bloodline was a crossroads, Ojibwe from his mother's side, French from his father's. And like so many others born in this twilight between nations, he belonged everywhere and nowhere. He could read the flight of a goose and the edge of a map. He could tan a hide by smoke and recite the Catholic prayers in French. He carried 2 languages on his tongue, 2 songs in his bones. And he was not alone. From the late 1700s through the early 1800s, a new nation began to form. Not on parchment, not in parliaments, but in the wild country where rivers twist like stories, and winter can kill a man in a single night. These were the people of birch bark and bloodlines, the Métis. And among them were the ancestors of the little shell. They weren't born in capitals. They were born beside trade routes, the great rivers that cut through what we now call Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and the Dakota Plains. These waterways weren't just geography, they were economy, they were diplomacy, and they were danger. Every spring, canoes heavy with fur left these backcountry camps for the Hudson Bay Company posts. They moved like floating freight trains, propelled by muscle, song, and deep knowledge of the currents. Beaver, muskrat, mink, and marten, each pelt a link in the long chain of survival. The men who piloted these canoes, the voyageurs, were French by blood but often native by heart. And in the long months between ice and harvest, many of them took wives from the tribes they travelled through. But these were not temporary arrangements. Many of those unions forged something deeper than a contract. They created kinship. A Métis village was not a place of stone walls or grid maps. It was a place of movement, a place of hide tents and log cabins, of fiddle music one night and sweat lodge prayers the next. The women tanned hides with brain and smoke. They stitched clothing from deer sinew, dyed with boiled bark and ochre. The men carved traps, set snares, and built snow shelters with spruce limbs and woven grass. Even the children learned how to gather Labrador tea or how to read the sky for storms. There were no straight lines here, no flags, just survival, stitched together from 2 worlds. Some built winter homes of log and chinked mud near the Red River. Others wandered the plains in carts, the famous Red River carts, rickety but reliable, made without a single nail. The squeal of their wooden wheels became the sound of a people on the move. Métis hunting parties, hundreds strong, would travel across the open prairie to follow the buffalo herds. These hunts were not chaos. They were orchestrated like military campaigns. Elected leaders, pre-dawn councils, signals with flags, laws of engagement. Because order, like survival, was sacred. And for the little shell ancestors, order came from balance. The French and the Ojibwe, the European and the native, the forest and the fire. They were guides, interpreters, craftsmen, scouts, diplomats. They could speak to traders and tribal councils with equal fluency. But that fluency came at a cost. To many colonial governments, they were convenient, useful, until they weren't. The Métis were too native for the settlers, too European for the tribes. Their mobility, their skill, their refusal to be pinned down, all of it made them dangerous in the eyes of expanding empires. By the early 1800s, both British and American interests began to tighten their grip on land and trade. Licenses, boundaries, and treaties began to appear. Lines, where there had never been lines, and those who had survived without them were suddenly accused of trespassing. In the Red River Rebellion of 1869, Louis Riel, a Métis leader, would famously declare that we are a nation and we want recognition as a nation. But the price of that declaration would be exile, imprisonment, and execution. The Little Shell ancestors watched closely. They were not born rebels, but they would become resistors. In the high borderlands of Montana and Canada, they built homes where the law had not yet reached. They lived off the land with skill passed down through generations, drying meat over willow fires, harvesting chokecherries and camas root, tanning buffalo hides with sandstone and marrow. The men carried flintlock rifles, but many still favored the bow, silent, reliable, and easier to repair. The women were healers and storytellers. The children learned to trap snowshoe hare before they could spell their own names. They were never rich, but they were not poor, because the land, while harsh, gave back what was honored. But to the American government, land was not sacred. It was capital. And by the 1850s, surveyors and railroad agents had begun to move westward like storm fronts, buying, mapping, cutting. When they looked at the Métis and the Little Shell bands, they didn't see families. They saw obstacles. Treaty councils were called. Some tribes signed under pressure, ceding ancestral ground in exchange for reservations, rations, and promises. But the Little Shell bands, led in later years by Ayabe Wewitung, the man called Little Shell, refused. They were not nomads. They were not guests. They were the land. And they knew what would happen if they traded it away. They had watched what happened at Standing Rock, at Sandy Lake, at the Red River. The treaties were never kept. The agents were never fair. And once the ink dried, the land was gone forever. So they held their ground. It would cost them everything. In the years to come, they would be labeled landless. They would be excluded from roles, denied food, medical aid, and even burial rights. But this was not the story of a vanishing people. It was the story of a people who refused to vanish. They carried their nations not on paper, but in skin and memory. They passed down their stories not through books, but through firelight and song. They hunted in silence, not protest. They endured in motion, not resistance. And the birch bark still held their names, etched in smoke, stitched into the seams of every fur trade coat and buffalo robe, hidden in the songs sung over boiled meat, whispered in the laughter of children as they ran across snowfields with bare feet and full hearts. The Little Shell were born not of empires, but of survival. And their bloodlines, tangled, ancient, undeniable, were not something to be questioned. They were something to be honored. The wind over Turtle Mountain did not ask permission to blow. It stirred through the pines like breath across an old wound, steady, sorrowful, unrelenting. Beneath that wind, under a sky that carried the taste of iron and winter, a man stood with his arms folded across his chest, watching the land that had raised him try to survive its own erasure. His name was Ayabe Wewitung. The world would remember him as Little Shell. But names, like nations, carry more than syllables. They carry weight, and his would become heavier than most men could bear. He was born into a time of thunder, not the kind that rolled through the sky, but the kind that came with treaties and tracks. Railroads, driven by greed and powered by iron, were crawling west like serpents. They didn't follow rivers. They didn't respect migrations. They carved new paths, indifferent to what they crossed. And in their wake came land agents, military forts, surveyors' chains, and the cold promises of the US government. Turtle Mountain, where Little Shell's people had lived for generations, was now being looked at through a different lens, one measured in acres, not in memory, one that didn't see burial grounds or medicine routes, just timber, farmland, and lines on a ledger. Little Shell knew what was coming. He was no warrior in the traditional sense. He carried no war lance, led no raids. But his resistance was quieter and perhaps more dangerous. He was a statesman, a negotiator, a man who understood that survival in the 19th century would not come from arrows, but from language. And when the white men came, wearing their government titles and carrying their pre-drawn maps, he met them not with hostility, but with resolve. In 1892, Little Shell was summoned to meet with US Indian Commissioner George W. Manypenny to discuss a new land agreement, one that would effectively remove the Turtle Mountain Chippewa from their homeland and relocate them to a reservation elsewhere. The terms offered were $1 per acre for millions of acres of land. Insulting, insane. Little Shell countered with 10 cents more per acre, a modest increase, still well below value, but enough to demand dignity. He never got a reply. The government had already decided the land would be taken, with or without a signature, and when Little Shell refused to sign, they found other chiefs, willing ones, paper ones. A council of 32 was gathered, some with questionable legitimacy, and they signed the Macumber Agreement, sealing the fate of Turtle Mountain in ink, not consent. For Little Shell, it was a betrayal not just of land, but of law, of principle. And from that moment on, his people were written out. The Little Shell Band was erased from federal recognition. No reservation, no rations, no schools, no doctors, no protection under treaty law. They were deemed landless, as if land had ever defined them, as if being removed from a government list could remove them from the earth itself. But Little Shell did not bow. He took his people west, not in retreat, but in endurance. Montana was not kind to them at first. It was wind-scoured and unsettled, with bitter winters and long distances between settlements. But it was freer than what lay behind. So they travelled by wagon, cart and foot, whole families moving through cottonwood bottoms and dry plains, setting up temporary camps on the edges of mining towns and railroad depots. They lived in dugouts, in canvas teepees, in abandoned cabins roofed with bark. Their tools were old but effective, flint strikers for fire, knives carried in braided sheaths, a single musket passed down, still wrapped in oilskin. Children gathered kindling and dug snow pits. Women dried venison over coals, using salt traded for labour. The elders told stories to keep the language alive, stories of wind spirits, lake monsters, and the boy who turned into a bird when the world became too heavy. But even here, on the margins, they were hunted. Not by soldiers, but by the cold mechanisms of policy. Census takers ignored them. Indian agents refused them. Children were forcibly taken to schools where their hair was cut and their names replaced. Settlers accused them of trespassing on lands that once belonged to their ancestors. They had no title, no treaty, no vote, only blood, memory, and firelight. And still, Little Shell fought. He petitioned the government, travelled to Washington, wrote letters, hired lawyers, pleaded for recognition, not just for his people's legal identity, but for their survival. He demanded the truth be acknowledged, that his people had never surrendered, never signed, never sold. But the halls of power are slow to listen and quick to forget. In 1901, at the age of 76, Chief Little Shell died, not in battle, not in fame, but quietly, among his people, still landless, still unseen. His grave, unmarked for years, held the bones of a man who had tried to hold back the tide with words, and when the tide rose anyway, walked through it with dignity. The name, however, did not die. It became something more. In the mouths of elders, Little Shell became a story, not of defeat, but of refusal. In the mouths of children, it became a name to stand taller beneath. In the mouths of historians, eventually, it became an error to correct, a record to restore. But for the people who bore it, it was always flesh, always bone, a bloodline stitched with the pain of erasure and the power of remembering. To live without land is one thing, to live without name is another. But the little shell did both for over 100 years and never once forgot who they were. They remembered the man who told the government, no. They remembered the place where the wind always carried pine. They remembered the name that never stopped becoming real. The snow came early that year. It was not a gentle curtain, not the slow drift that softens the land. It came with wind, sharp, cutting, merciless, the kind of cold that does not wait for permission. By the end of the first week, the trails had vanished. The trees groaned under the weight of ice. The rivers froze solid, not just at their surface, but all the way to the bone. And into this frozen silence, the little shell people walked. There was no proclamation, no wagons of supplies, no flags or cavalry escorts. Only families, whole lineages, shouldering what they could carry, wrapped in blankets stitched by their grandmothers, leading children too cold to cry. They were moving west, away from Turtle Mountain, away from the land that had raised them, away from the last promise broken, not in protest, in necessity. The government had drawn its lines, refused their name, struck them from the lists. The land they'd defended for generations was taken, signed away by others. What was left was nothing. No reservation, no ration book, no shelter. The newspapers called them stragglers, vagabonds, unattached Indians. The term landless Chippewa had entered the political vocabulary, a bureaucratic phrase to cover a human wound. But they were not landless. They carried the land in their breath, their bones, their stories. And now they carried it west, into Montana. The journey was over 400 miles. No maps, no welcome. They followed game trails and river bends, moving in small groups to avoid detection. Their elders still remembered the patterns of the stars, the taste of different snow, the wind's change when buffalo were near. At night, they built fires low in stone rings, hidden in hollows. The smoke curled upward in silence. There were no roads in that wilderness, just frozen ground and survival. A father fashioned a sled from an old door lashed with rawhide. On it, 2 children and a bundle of smoked meat. A grandmother walked beside them, face wrapped in wool, eyes fixed on a future she knew she would never see. One boy's boots had worn through, so his uncle took the skin of a rabbit and tied it with sinew around his feet. It held just long enough to keep the frostbite from reaching the bone. They drank from snowmelt, boiled over embers in metal cans, scavenged from rail camps. When meat ran low, they snared hare and pulled marrow from broken deer bones. A young woman found choke cherries beneath a drift. She chewed them with dried fat to make a paste for the infants, the only food their small mouths could take. But even in this hunger, there was ceremony. Each night, someone told a story. Around those meager fires, the old tales lived, the ones of the sky woman and the muskrat, of the stone canoe, of the long-beaked spirit that guards the doorway between the worlds. These were not distractions. They were maps of the soul. And in the bitter cold of exile, they gave the people a center to orbit. One elder, blind in one eye and half lamed by a war injury, told the children, "The fire doesn't need to be big, just true." They believed him. In the first month, 3 elders died, one in sleep, one of fever, one simply laid down and stopped. They were buried in shallow graves beneath spruce trees, wrapped in buffalo hides, with a circle of stones placed on top. No cross, just the names whispered 3 times into the wind. It was not the first time they'd buried without ceremony, and it wouldn't be the last. By the second month, the snow had thickened. Their passage through the land left no trace. Coyotes trailed them at night, their yellow eyes blinking from behind brush. In one camp, a woman gave birth beneath a pine bough shelter, the child arriving in a silent scream that echoed through the branches. They named her Ayasha, Little One. Her first blanket was a strip of her father's coat. Her lullaby was the wind through lodgepole pine. Near what would one day be Havre, Montana, they crossed a frozen stream and found the carcass of a buffalo, half scavenged by wolves, but still enough meat to save a dozen lives. They built a shelter from its ribs, covering it in stretched hide and moss. For 5 days, they slept in shifts. Warmth returned to fingers. Lips cracked with laughter again. A boy carved a whistle from birch wood. Another made a sling to hunt birds. That was how it went. Death, then fire. Grief, then song. Hunger, then shelter. The little shell never asked to be pioneers. They didn't want to blaze trails. But every mile they walked westward was an act of definition. If the government wouldn't name them, they would name themselves again with every footstep, with every child born, with every fire lit in snow. In one camp, they built stone walls waist high, packed with snow and sealed with mud. They used spruce boughs for roofs, weighed down with rocks. Inside, small fires burned, banked with ash to last the night. They slept in circles, feet to the heat, heads to the wall. That winter, they invented new ways to survive, trapping prairie dogs, drying pine needles to make tea rich in vitamin C, chewing willow bark for pain. A white homesteader, riding past one of these camps, wrote in his journal, "Saw a band of Indians building out of stone, quiet folk, didn't beg, looked like ghosts with fire in their eyes." They weren't ghosts, they were ancestors in the making. By spring, the ground softened. The rivers began to run. Snow gave way to mud, and mud gave way to wild grass. The little shell camps followed the thaw. They knew this land now, its deer paths, its berry groves, the slopes where camas flowered thick. They had buried their dead here, spoken their language into its soil. This was not yet a homeland, but it had become sacred. They weren't granted land. They claimed it, not with conquest, but with endurance. And still, they were not seen. Settlers passed them on the road without greeting. Surveyors noted non-treaty Indians on the margins of their maps. Officials labeled them displaced, mixed blood, unauthorized. But they were never unnamed. They were the children of Ayabewe Witung. They were the carriers of the long fire. They were the singers of the stories no schoolroom ever taught. And in that winter, that brutal, unsheltered, fire-forged winter, they wrote themselves into the land, not in ink, but in memory and in survival. ChatGPT said, "The wind through the cottonwoods whispered like a voice that hadn't spoken in years, soft, dry, full of names. Names that were never written down. Names no courthouse would recognize. But in the ravines and high hills of Montana, they were still spoken, passed from grandfather to grandchild, like flint passed from hand to hand. By the early 20th century, the United States had declared the Little Shell people to be a people no longer. There was no reservation, no federal roles, no agency to issue rations or recognize births. In the eyes of Washington, the Little Shell had vanished, absorbed, dispersed, forgotten. But they hadn't vanished. They'd simply stepped sideways into a different kind of survival, one without documentation, but full of memory. You could find them in the margins, on the edge of the railroad towns, where the soot from locomotives drifted like ash onto garden plots and firewood piles. In Great Falls, in Havre, in Shelby, always a little outside the city limits. They lived in cabins built by their own hands, from milled-off lumber and driftwood, roofed with tar paper and patched with tin. Their homes weren't elegant, but they were warm, heated by stoves that burned whatever the day could spare, pine knots, old boots, scavenged coal from the rail yards. Some worked as labourers, others as trappers, loggers, or ranch hands. Many simply lived from the land. They were not counted, not recognised, but they were there. And more than anything else, they remembered. In one log home, perched at the edge of a coulee, a man named Joseph Laframboise taught his grandson how to track mink. The snow was thin that year, barely enough to hold the imprint of a paw, but Joseph's eyes read the land like a page. "Watch where the grass is bent," he said. "That's where the body moved, not just the feet." He spoke in Mishif, the old Métis language, part French, part Ojibwe, full of weather and weight. Few outside their people could understand it, but it wasn't spoken for outsiders. It was spoken so the memory wouldn't go out. In another home, this one dug partly into a hill and warmed by firestone packed with clay. An elder named Marie kept a pouch of dried herbs hung over her stove. It smelled of sweetgrass, bare root, and cedar. When neighbors were sick, they came to her. She would listen to the body, to the voice, to the quiet spaces in between. Then she would reach for what the land had taught her. She didn't call herself a healer. She didn't need to. The people called her grandmother. And that was enough. Through the 1920s and 30s, while the nation obsessed over the Dust Bowl and the Depression, the little shell slipped quietly through the cracks. Their children were often sent to Indian boarding schools if discovered, but many families kept their distance, moving often, avoiding enrollment, holding fast to their anonymity. It was not safety, it was strategy. They hunted under moonlight, using traps passed down through bloodlines, deadfalls made from stone and levered logs, steel traps cleaned with vinegar and boiled in spruce sap to hide human scent. In the spring, they gathered bitterroot and camas bulbs. In summer, they dried chokecherries into pemmican. In autumn, they followed the deer, learning where they bedded, how they circled back if left undisturbed. None of it was written down, but every piece of it was known. One boy, born near Fort Benton in 1941, recalled how his grandfather would tie a bit of bone to a length of sinew and drop it down into a gopher hole. He called it the old hook, the boy said. Worked better than any trap I ever saw. They passed down more than tricks. They passed down a way of seeing, a way of belonging to a place that had erased them on paper, but still whispered to them in the wind, because the land remembered. In the high breaks along the Missouri River, old trails still held the memory of moccasins. Berry bushes still bloomed where grandmothers had once planted seeds with ash-soaked fingers. The beading patterns on mittens mirrored the constellations overhead, symbols of continuity that reached past documentation, past law, past even flesh. In every corner of Montana, the little shell lived in the places people didn't look. In the abandoned rail cars turned into homes. In the deer-blind cabins, tucked into the tree line. In the campfires made from willow and sagebrush, where songs were sung not for performance, but for the ancestors. Those who'd survived Turtle Mountain, who'd crossed the winter plains with no banner but memory. And still, they endured. In 1954, the US government reaffirmed its stance. The little shell had no land base, no recognized government, no legal presence. But by then, the people had long since stopped waiting for Washington's approval. They had formed councils, not official ones, quiet ones, built around kitchen tables, in borrowed church basements, in circles around wood stoves where decisions were made with more honor than any congressional vote. They had their own schools, not institutions, but teachings. A grandmother teaching a child how to sew a parfleche pouch from rawhide. An uncle showing his nephew how to walk across snow without leaving a trail. A mother whispering stories about the lake spirit that weeps at night if children forget their names. These were not just customs. They were tools of survival. A little shell boy in the 1960s might have worn second-hand boots and gone hungry for a week, but he could also build a deadfall trap, read the sky for storm fronts, and gut a fish using only a flake of glass. His identity wasn't found in school records or birth certificates. It was in his hands, his memory, his name. They lived like ghosts, the historians would later say. But they weren't ghosts. They were roots, deep, silent, and immovable. The government couldn't see them, but the land did. And in every leaf that turned with the seasons, in every coyote howl at dusk, in every cedar bough laid on a burial fire, the little shell was still here, unwritten but unbroken. The wind coming off the high plains carried dust, bone, and rumour. By the early 1900s, the little shell people were no longer just invisible, they were exposed. Without land, without federal recognition, and without legal protection, they lived in the gaps of a rising American machine that knew how to take, but never how to see. There were no treaties to enforce, no agents assigned to their welfare, no reservation line to hide behind. And in that vacuum, exploitation moved in like a sickness. The whiskey traders came first. They arrived in rickety wagons and left behind glass bottles. They knew exactly where to go, to the camps on the outskirts of towns like Havre and Malta, where families burned cow dung for fuel and children wore moccasins stitched from grain sacks. A gallon jug of whiskey could buy a man's day, a woman's labour, even a child's silence. They offered it as payment for firewood, beadwork, or pelts. They traded it for antlers and arrowheads, for anything that had once been a symbol of survival. For the little shell, landless, impoverished, and unprotected, it was a poison with many faces. Some resisted, others fell. And when the bottle emptied, there was no help, no justice, no restitution. Just another page turned. A little shell elder named Raymond would later say, "They never came with kindness, only currency, and sometimes the currency was rot in a glass." Behind the traders came the Indian agents, but not for the little shell. Agents were appointed to oversee reservation tribes, to deliver rations, to monitor schooling, to control movement. But for a people who legally didn't exist, there was no oversight, no one to file a complaint, no office to enter, no pencil to right the wrongs with. That absence became a weapon. Local sheriffs turned blind eyes. Employers paid wages in whiskey or canned goods, or sometimes not at all. Children were taken from their families, not through law, but by the quiet force of poverty. Removed under charges of neglect and placed in white homes, their names changed, their language forbidden. Others were sent to boarding schools where braids were cut and mouths washed with soap for speaking Michif or Ojibwe. One boy, taken from the Bear Paw Mountains in 1927, returned home 6 years later, unable to remember his grandmother's name. That forgetting was not accidental. It was engineered. Teachers at the boarding schools were instructed to erase, not just the words, but the rhythms, the memories, the relational world that had bound little shell families for generations. Stories once told around the fire were now mocked in chalk. Songs became sins. Kinship was reduced to surnames on ledgers written by strangers. And still, they endured. Back in the camps, back in the cabins and dugouts and abandoned mining shacks, the stories didn't vanish. They just went underground. Songs were whispered instead of sung. Dances took place behind hung blankets, under the cover of dusk. Children were taught 2 names, one for school and one for the fire, one for the record books and one that would follow them into the spirit world. A grandmother might press a piece of sweetgrass into a child's hand and say, "Remember this smell. If they take everything else, this will bring you home." That act, small, quiet, easily overlooked, was defiance. The little shell didn't fight with guns. They fought with memory. They fought by not forgetting. And in a world built to deny them, every remembrance became a kind of revolution. But it wasn't without cost. Men worked rail lines for $1 a day, sleeping in boxcars, eating cold beans from tin cans. Women cleaned rooms in frontier hotels, where the guests called them half-breeds to their face. Their children were ridiculed in public schools, not quite Indian, not quite white, always an echo of something the New World didn't want to face. In one town, a group of little shell boys was refused entrance to a swimming hole. When they returned the next day, they came not with weapons, but with sage. They burned it in the water. When asked why, the oldest one said, to remind the spirits that we're still here. That boy would later disappear from the census, but not from the stories. The 1930s brought more suffering. The Great Depression hit Indian country harder than most places. And for the Little Shell, who were already outside of legal recognition, the blow was devastating. Relief rations passed them by. Federal programs overlooked their names. Even other tribes bound by treaties had more protection. Still, the camps stayed alive. Firewood was gathered in shifts. Community meals were shared from iron pots, large enough to hold a deer shoulder and wild onions. Beadwork kept idle hands moving. The young were taught how to snare rabbits using bent twigs and tensioned sinew. Even in the worst winters, when frost formed inside cabin walls and the snow drifted to roof height, someone would boil tea from cedar bark and tell the children about the old ones who turned into wolves to protect the people. One woman, Marie Iron Rope, lived alone on a patch of hilltop near Box Elder. She had no running water, no stove, and only a rusted shotgun for protection. But every Sunday, children from nearby families would walk up to her cabin. She would give them tea, break them fry bread, and tell them stories so old even the sky seemed to stop and listen. When a census worker finally reached her in 1943, he asked what tribe she belonged to. She said, "The one you forgot." He wrote down, "Undetermined." That was the world the Little Shell lived in, where truth was recorded only when convenient, and survival depended on what you could carry in your hands and hold in your heart. But they never stopped carrying. The men who labored in silence, the women who taught songs in whispers, the children who buried their native names deep like seeds. They were all part of a quiet, ongoing resistance, not to conquer, but to remain. And in time, that quiet grew louder, not in the streets, not with signs or slogans, but in the unbroken chain of firelight and memory, in the bead patterns that matched the constellations, in the stories that turned pain into guidance, in the sacred names spoken only at night. The government saw no nation, but the hills did, the rivers did, and the wind, even after all those years, still spoke it clearly. They were still here, still whole, still Little Shell. The snow had started to fall when John Sinclair first stepped onto the courthouse steps, petition clutched beneath his coat like an ember he couldn't let go out. It was 1934. Great Falls was grey with winter. The wind off the river tore at the corners of his coat, but he stood tall, not out of comfort, but conviction. He was not a warrior in the traditional sense. He carried no rifle, wore no feathers, but his weapon was memory. His armor was names, hundreds of them, scribbled in shaky cursive across the pages he carried. Names of the forgotten, names the government refused to see, names he refused to let vanish. They were Little Shell, and the fight for recognition had begun. The 1930s were not kind to anyone in Montana, but they were especially cruel to those without land. The Little Shell people, scattered across the state in makeshift homes, abandoned railroad cars, and dugout shelters, had survived everything the 19th century threw at them. But survival wasn't the same as acknowledgement. Without federal recognition, they had no legal tribe, no sovereignty, no protection. They couldn't vote on Indian policy, couldn't access Indian health services, couldn't send their children to bureau-run schools. To Washington, they didn't exist, but they did. They lived in the land's long memory, in stories passed over campfires and kitchen tables, in the lines on John Sinclair's petition. That petition, the first of many, wasn't just a form. It was a declaration, a challenge to a system built to erase them. It listed over 400 names, elders, children, families, and declared, in quiet handwriting, that these were the descendants of Ayabewewi Tung, the Little Shell, the landless but never voiceless. Sinclair wasn't a trained lawyer. He had no wealth, no political backing, but he had something harder to dismantle: resolve. He traveled to Washington, D.C. by train, wearing a borrowed suit, and carrying a leather satchel. Inside were affidavits, baptism records, personal testimonies. He walked through the marble corridors of government buildings like a man walking into a blizzard, knowing the cold would be there but walking anyway. He met with commissioners, filed applications, waited for letters that never came. And when silence was the only answer, he tried again. In 1937, he helped form a tribal committee, not sanctioned by any agency, but rooted in community. They met in church basements, in living rooms, wherever a table and a pot of coffee could be found. Their tools were pencils, family Bibles, and memory. They built lineage charts by lamplight, reconstructed tribal roles from oral accounts. They translated Old French and Ojibwe names into legal records. Every document was a stitch, sewing back together what the system had torn apart. That same year, they submitted a new petition to the Department of the Interior. It was denied. Too vague, the government said. Insufficient documentation. No clear legal link to a recognized tribe. The Little Shell were told that because they had no land, they had no claim. Because they had no reservation, they had no history. But the irony was sharp. It was the refusal to sign away land, the very act that had made Little Shell III a pariah in government eyes, that now served as proof of his people's supposed non-existence. And still, they pushed forward. They filed again in 1940, and again in 1942. Each time, the answer was the same: denied, delayed, discarded. But the movement was growing. Younger members joined the cause. Women like Margaret Belcourt and Agnes Morin began organizing meetings, translating documents, ensuring that the efforts of the elders would not be lost in fatigue. Petitions were carried door to door, names collected, family trees drawn from memory. A man named Eugene Larocque reportedly walked 120 miles on foot to collect signatures, sleeping in hay barns and empty boxcars. He carried no flag, only a clipboard. They weren't trying to start a war. They were trying to prove they had already survived one. The resistance wasn't loud. It didn't make headlines. It looked like a father teaching his daughter to write her great-grandmother's Ojibwe name. It looked like a mother hiding sacred tobacco from school officials. It looked like old men smoking pipes behind wood stoves, speaking softly in Michif, knowing the language was vanishing but speaking it anyway. The pipe smoke in those rooms didn't just curl with memory. It carried resolve. That was how the fight for recognition lived in those years. Not in protests, but in paper. Not in demonstrations, but in documentation. And every name written, every form filed, was an act of spiritual defiance. In 1945, with the world reeling from war, the Little Shell submitted yet another petition. This one, longer and more detailed, came with birth certificates, land deeds, church records, everything the federal government had asked for. But again, the response was silence. No acknowledgement, no review. Just another delay. A tribal elder wrote in her journal, "We must be the only people who must beg to be counted. They took everything and then said, we are not real." That was the heart of it. To be denied after loss, to be made invisible after already surviving the theft of homeland, the erasure of name, the removal of language. It wasn't just bureaucratic cruelty, it was spiritual violence. But they didn't yield. They continued gathering, continued filing, continued teaching their children what the government refused to learn. There were no parades, no fireworks, but there was endurance. The Little Shell survived in the shadows of courthouses and on the edges of every census page. They survived in the ledger margins, in the backroom meetings, in the hours spent searching for records that had been misfiled or conveniently lost. They survived in the firelit kitchens where elders refused to let the name go cold. They had no land, but they had memory. They had no federal code, but they had kinship. They had no recognition, but they had purpose. And even though the doors to Washington remained closed, The people inside those doors were slowly beginning to feel the presence of a nation that refused to go away. Because recognition is not always granted. Sometimes it is reclaimed, name by name, signature by signature, generation by generation. John Sinclair would not live to see his people recognized, but he left something stronger than a court ruling. He left a path, and others would follow. The floor creaked beneath his chair, a slow sigh of aged pine and winters long gone. Outside, the wind moved through the bare cottonwoods like breath through teeth. But inside the cabin, the fire crackled. It was not a loud fire, just steady, like the man sitting in front of it, hands resting on his knees, eyes on the orange glow. His name was Louis Forster, 83 winters behind him. His hearing had faded. His legs didn't walk like they used to, but his mind, his memory, burned bright, brighter than the flames in the stove. And when he began to speak, it wasn't just words. It was weather, seasons, smells, sounds. A world long buried, now slowly rising back into light. He was born in a sod dugout outside of Box Elder, sometime in the 1930s. He didn't know the exact year. "We weren't on the books," he said, with a dry chuckle, "but we were sure enough on the earth." His mother was Métis, his father, Chippewa Cree. They had nothing the government wanted. No land deed, no title, no federal ID. But they had what no law could touch, a way of knowing the world. His mother cooked over coals sunk into the ground, the roof overhead made of tar paper and bent willow branches. In winter, frost would form on the inside walls, and Louis would scrape it off with a bone spoon, chewing the ice like candy. He remembered his grandfather, a quiet man with deep-set eyes and a voice like sandpaper. They would walk the ridgeline before dawn, checking snow traps. The traps were simple: willow bows bent under tension, lashed with sinew, triggered by a notch carved with a crooked knife. They'd catch hare, sometimes grouse, once a fox, but the fox they let go. "Not everything is for eating," his grandfather said. "Some things are just for reminding." Louis didn't understand then. He does now. Beside him, in that same cabin, sat his daughter Annie, middle-aged now, her braids streaked with grey, fingers busy threading beads onto sinew. Her hands moved fast, but her voice was slow. She grew up in the same hills, but in a different world. A world where the state sent social workers to take children from improper homes. A world where school teachers punished kids for speaking Michif. A world where grocery store owners watched her like a thief because she wore moccasins and carried a name they couldn't pronounce. "I used to whisper to my shoes when I walked to school," she said. "That way, I didn't forget how we prayed. The shoes always listened." She learned to tan hides from her aunt, using brains boiled with water and rubbed into the flesh side with a smooth stone. The smell was terrible, the work brutal. But when she pulled that hide taut and saw the softness beneath, she saw herself, not on paper, but in practice. That was how the little shell lived, not in documents, but in doing. A fire started with birch bark, a parfleche pouch tied with deer sinew, a cedar sprig tucked into a baby's cradle. These weren't artifacts. They were declarations. In the third chair, not far from the stove, sat Annie's son, Caleb, 19 years old. Hoodie, earbuds, eyes that flicked between his elders and the phone screen in his lap. But when his mother spoke in Michif, he looked up. When she handed him a finished bead strip, he took it carefully, like a feather from a hawk. He was born in a hospital, went to public school, knew more about Instagram than the inside of a lodge, but he also knew how to snare rabbit, how to boil pine needles into tea, how to ask the ancestors for guidance before crossing unfamiliar land. Because his grandfather never stopped telling stories, and stories are the oldest weapons against forgetting. Louis remembered the old camps, cabins buried in snow, families huddled together, passing around a single tin plate of fry bread. No electricity, no running water. But there was always a song. His aunt would hum it as she stirred the pot. His uncle would tap it on the table with a knife handle. They never sang loud, not after the schools came, but they sang. Annie remembered the language being forbidden. Her classmates teased her for the way she spoke. So she stopped speaking it out loud, started writing words under her pillow. She said them to the trees, to the fire, to the wind. Caleb remembers hearing the language in dreams. Each generation carried something the last one buried. That's how it survived. Not in museums, not in academic journals, but in memory that refused to die, in beadwork that matched the stars, in old coffee cans filled with sweetgrass and sage. A photograph hung above the stove, grainy, black and white, edges curled with age. It was Little Shell himself, Ayabe Wewitung, standing stiff in a wool coat, eyes unreadable, mouth set like a cliff. He never signed the treaty, never gave up the land, and for that they had tried to erase him. But his descendants, these 3 generations in a warm cabin on a cold Montana night, they were proof of his refusal. Louis tapped the floor with his boot, a rhythm, a heartbeat. "We were never gone," he said. "We were just quiet." Outside, the snow started to fall, light at first, then thicker, until the trees blurred at their edges. It looked like silence, but it wasn't. It was memory, coming down from the sky, and inside the cabin the fire still burned. The soil on the Montana plains is thick with memory. Step into it after a hard rain, and you'll leave more than footprints. You'll disturb what lies beneath: bones, roots, ash, stories. For the Little Shell people, this land holds more than dust and stone. It holds the map of who they are, not written in ink, but in marrow, not measured in percentages, but in breath and burial. But in the 1990s, the world began asking a different question, a colder one. Where is your proof? It wasn't enough anymore to carry a family name, to remember the songs your grandmother sang over fry bread, to speak Machif with your uncle by the fire. Suddenly, recognition required data, DNA, documents, blood quantum charts drawn with bureaucratic precision. What could not be measured could be denied. It began quietly: letters from government agencies, updated tribal enrollment forms, a new language, eligibility, threshold, verification, terms that reduced ancestry to fractions, that asked, "Are you Indian enough?" Some saw this as a chance, a way to fight with the tools of the colonizer. Genetic testing, after all, could confirm what oral history had long held. For some Little Shell families, the results brought validation. Mitochondrial DNA linked them back to Ojibwe ancestors. Y chromosome markers tied them to known tribal lineages. For a few, the science gave them a legal foothold in a nation that had spent a century denying they ever existed. But for others, it felt like betrayal. An elder named Josephine Lafleur said it best: "They took the land. They took the language. Now they want to take the way we know who we are." To her, and to many like her, identity could not be swabbed from the inside of a cheek. It was built in the bend of a knee over a fire pit, in the rhythm of a paddle on a lake, in the way a child learned to tie a trap with rawhide and prayer. That kind of knowing, passed from hands to hands, breath to breath, didn't show up in a lab report. Josephine's story echoed across camp circles and community centers. Her great-grandfather had traveled with Chief Little Shell during the forced migration west. He died in a snow shelter somewhere near present-day Glasgow, Montana, and was buried under a pile of river stones. No grave marker, no ceremony, just a name whispered into the wind and carried into the next generation. For her, that act of remembrance was more sacred than any percentage printed on a certificate. And yet, the pressure grew. By the mid-1990s, tribal enrollment boards across the country were tightening their standards. Some required 1/4 native blood. Others demanded documented descent from treaty rolls. The Little Shell, still fighting for federal recognition, found themselves split. Some pushed for DNA testing as a means of finally forcing the government's hand. Others resisted, fearing it would fracture the very identity they'd held together for generations without help from Washington. It wasn't just a political debate. It was personal. A young man named Richard, raised by his grandmother in a one-room cabin near Chinook, had grown up hearing he was Little Shell. He hunted elk with a longbow his grandfather carved. He spoke fragments of Michif mixed with English. He attended every tribal gathering. When he applied for enrollment, he was told he needed to prove it. So, he took the test. The results came back ambiguous. His maternal line traced to Cree ancestors in Saskatchewan. His paternal line, French, with no clear tribal linkage. The response from the review board was polite but cold. Unable to verify tribal affiliation at this time, Richard sat outside his grandmother's cabin that night, staring at the paper while the wind moved through the cottonwoods like a hymn. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands. His grandmother brought him tea, touched his shoulder, and said only, "They don't know what they're looking for." For her, Richard's identity had been proven years ago, in the way he cared for the fire, in how he folded tobacco into the earth before the hunt, in the songs he hummed when the first snow came. No swab could erase that. No test could explain it. Others took a different route. An anthropologist named Dr. Howard Graves, working with Little Shell historians in the late 90s, tried to bridge the gap. He interviewed dozens of families, recording their genealogies, comparing oral history to archival records, and using DNA not as judgment, but as context. He believed science could confirm what culture had preserved, that it didn't have to replace story, only support it. But even he admitted, the genome is only one piece of the truth, the rest lives in memory. In the end, it wasn't the DNA that bound the Little Shell together. It was the silence, the long, enduring silence between their erasure and their recognition. In that silence, they raised children. They buried their dead. They cooked stew on open fires. They trapped muskrat in frozen creeks. They painted beadwork with constellations their ancestors had followed across the Great Lakes and the Dakotas. They remembered. And it was that memory, not a chromosome, that kept them whole. In one home near the Milk River, a mother taught her daughters how to sew shell buttons onto a ceremonial sash. Each stitch, she said, marked a name. Not hers, not even their grandmother's. But names further back. Names never recorded. Names remembered only in the feel of the fabric. She paused, thread in hand, and asked the girls a question. If you bury your grandmother with love and raise your child with the same, what else do you need to prove who you are? The room fell silent. Outside, the wind rose. Somewhere in that wind was the answer. Not in numbers, but in story. Not in code, but in care. And that's what the Little Shell held onto in those uncertain years. As the debates raged, as the science advanced, as the papers piled up, they held onto each other, onto memory, onto land not owned, but honored. They walked the same ridgelines, gathered the same plants, whispered the same songs. The DNA of the land was not in the soil. It was in them. The snow along the Missouri River had started to melt when the first petition reached the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It was 1902. Chief Little Shell was dead. The land was gone, the people scattered. And yet, the voice of a nation not only remained, it rose. For more than 100 years, that voice would be ignored. Whispered in council meetings, echoed in classrooms built from scrap wood, shouted in the back rooms of congressional hearings. But it never stopped. Not once. The Little Shell people were told again and again that they did not exist. From the Roosevelt administration to Clinton's final days in office, more than a dozen efforts to gain federal recognition were denied, delayed, or simply buried under the weight of bureaucracy. But behind every closed door, there was another voice waiting to speak. Behind every failed bill, another hand willing to write. It was a legal silence that covered a century. But silence, when met with memory, doesn't last forever. In 1935, John Sinclair walked into a federal office carrying a rolled bundle of papers tied with deer hide. It was the first formal petition for recognition, signed by hundreds of Little Shell descendants, most of them living in rail camps, log homes, and schoolhouses along the High Line of northern Montana. The pages contained stories, names, baptismal records, bloodlines traced by memory rather than government census. The Bureau reviewed it and said nothing. They asked for more documentation, so Sinclair and others spent years collecting affidavits, gathering testimony from tribal elders who'd survived the relocation from Turtle Mountain. They dug into parish records from remote mission towns, requested government correspondence from dusty archives. Their files grew, their evidence deepened, their petition got longer. Still, the answer was silence. By the 1950s, many of those original elders had passed, but the next generation had already picked up the thread. Tribal leaders like Peter Favell and Eugene Parker formed councils, organized meetings, and hosted cultural gatherings, not just to keep the community alive, but to demonstrate what Washington refused to acknowledge, that the Little Shell were not a people of the past. They were a sovereign nation, alive, present, and prepared. They started programs, without grants, without government aid. They built tribal schools to teach the younger generations their own history. They ran cultural preservation events, health fairs, and youth mentorship camps. The tribe created its own constitution, its own enrollment process, its own vision for a future in a country that had never recognized its past. And still, the petitions went unheard. In 1978, under the Carter administration, the federal government established a formal process for tribal recognition, a new hope, and yet another maze. The process required detailed evidence of historical continuity, community cohesion, and political authority, documented across generations. But for a people driven off their lands and stripped of treaty status, what did documentation mean? The Little Shell submitted again. They included everything: oral histories, court transcripts, archaeological evidence, even anthropological surveys conducted by university scholars. Their case was strong. It was reviewed for 32 years. No answer. Meanwhile, their community kept building. The Little Shell Tribal Council, with no federal funds, ran food programs out of church basements. Volunteer clinics patched up elders who had nowhere else to go. Youth workshops taught language preservation using cassette tapes, recorded by the last fluent speakers. They did not wait for permission to be who they were. They simply were. By the late 1990s, Congressman Pat Williams of Montana introduced a bill in Congress to grant federal recognition to the Little Shell. It passed the House. But the Senate, distracted by other priorities, let it die. 2 years later, it was reintroduced. Died again. Under the Clinton administration, the Little Shell were told they were under active consideration. That phrase became a cruel refrain, repeated across 2 presidencies, 3 wars, and countless election cycles. Active consideration. All while tribal elders aged, sickened, and passed, without ever seeing their nation named. But the Little Shell did not stop. They showed up at every hearing, wrote letters, brought their children into the chambers of Congress so those halls would see the faces of the landless. They held powwows on school fields, sang old songs beneath interstate bridges, raised their flag in towns that never learned to pronounce their name. And finally, in 2009, they received a response. The Office of Federal Acknowledgement recommended denial. The report claimed that the Little Shell could not demonstrate continuous political authority, that the community was too scattered, that their leadership was not adequately documented. It was a knife to the chest. But it wasn't the end. The next year, Chairman Gerald Gray stood before a gathering in Great Falls and said, "We have waited 100 years. We will wait one more if we must. but we will not disappear. He was right. The tribe submitted further documentation. They secured bipartisan support from Montana senators and congressmen. Journalists began covering their fight. Advocacy groups formed. Petitions swelled. And slowly, the silence began to crack. In 2015, a new bill passed through the House of Representatives, then stalled again and again. But in 2019, something changed. After relentless pressure, public attention, and years of legal endurance, the Little Shell Recognition Act was included in the National Defense Authorization Act, a massive, bipartisan bill virtually guaranteed to pass. It was a strange vessel for justice. But justice for the Little Shell had never traveled the straight road. On December 20th, 2019, President Donald Trump signed the bill into law. After more than a century of legal erasure, the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians was federally recognized by the United States government. But recognition didn't come with applause. It came with quiet, tears in a grandmother's eyes. A worn flag hung from a trailer porch, a hand on a shoulder that had waited too long. The name Little Shell wasn't made more real that day. It had always been real. What changed was the weight lifted, a silence broken. The tribe did not begin in 2019. They endured through every year before it, building schools with no funding, healing each other with no doctors, remembering names with no ledgers. They had acted like a nation because they were one, with or without acknowledgement. And when the government finally caught up, they did not ask for celebration. They asked for space, for land, for the right to continue. Because 100 years of silence does not end with a signature. It ends with breath. And that breath, whispered over sacred ground, spoken in a language nearly lost, carried in the bones of children who still dance under Montana's stars, is still rising. ChatGPT said, "The sky over Great Falls that morning was pale, like paper left too long in the sun. The wind came down from the Highwood Mountains cold and sharp, carrying with it no sound, but the occasional rustle of dried cottonwood leaves and the hiss of tires on winter pavement." It was December 20th, 2019. The kind of day that doesn't ask for attention, but becomes unforgettable anyway. Inside a modest tribal office near Central Avenue, a group of elders stood gathered around a small television set. A coffee pot bubbled behind them. Someone had brought fry bread. A folded flag rested on the table. Not raised, not waving, just resting, quiet, waiting. The broadcast wasn't dramatic. No fireworks, no national headlines screaming across the screen. But somewhere in Washington, D.C., far from these hills and this cold, the President of the United States signed his name on a document buried deep within the folds of a federal bill. And with the stroke of that pen, something that had been known in fire, in blood, in story, for generations, became law. The Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians was now officially recognized by the United States government. It took a moment to sink in. An elder in her 90s, wrapped in a star quilt, placed her hand on her chest and whispered something in Ojibwe. A younger man beside her held back tears. Another opened the door and stepped outside, needing air, needing sky, recognition. Not a gift, not a favor. A correction, late, flawed, incomplete, but a correction nonetheless. For over 150 years, the Little Shell people had lived beneath the words non-recognized, as if the absence of federal paperwork could somehow negate the presence of a nation. They'd been told their culture wasn't coherent enough, their leadership too fractured, their identity too diluted. They'd been asked to prove their existence over and over again, in a country that had long ago taken their land and forgotten their names. But on this cold morning, the forgetting stopped. Still, the joy wasn't clean. It couldn't be. Because this wasn't just a victory, it was the end of an exile. And exile, once lifted, leaves behind it scars. Across Montana, in trailers and cabins and snowbound homes, the reaction came, in waves. Elders picked up phones with shaking hands. They called children and grandchildren scattered across the country. "We did it," they said, or simply, "They finally see us." Some lit fires, others just sat in silence, letting the moment settle deep into the places that had ached for too long. But even as the words were spoken, federally recognized tribe, there was something else rising beneath them. Grief. Not for the lost battles, but for the lives lived without this moment. For the generations who never saw it. For Chief Little Shell III, who had stood firm at Turtle Mountain, refusing to sell what could not be bought, and who died landless, paperless, but unbroken. For John Sinclair, who spent decades writing petitions in longhand, walking court papers through snow to post offices that never called back. For the women who raised children with no government services, who taught them songs that had no place on school lesson plans. And for the children who were taken, for the families split, for the names erased in boarding schools where mischief was called a curse. Recognition could not rewrite that. It could only stand beside it, as both reverence and reckoning. At Fort Belknap, an elder named Marlene Latreille sat with her granddaughter and folded tobacco into a red cloth. She burned it slowly, letting the smoke drift upward, curling around the rafters of her small cabin. She spoke the names of her parents, her grandparents, her great-grandmother who had walked from North Dakota to Montana during the forced migration. She didn't speak loud. She didn't need to. "The paper caught up to what we already knew," she said. "Now, the world just has to listen." In tribal offices, the phones began to ring. Media, government agencies, old allies. Reporters asked what recognition would mean. Would there be land, casinos, schools? What benefits would come? But for the Little Shell, those questions missed the point. What recognition meant was that their name, whispered in firelight, etched into beadwork, held sacred through every season of silence, now stood. It stood in federal code. It stood in public record. And more importantly, it stood without apology. That night they gathered. In Great Falls, in Havre, in Lewistown. In VFW halls and church basements and open fields blanketed in snow. They gathered not as a people emerging, but as a people returning. To themselves, to their place, to their rightful place in the story of this land. There were songs. Old ones. The ones almost lost. There were hand drums and handshakes, tears and laughter, jokes spoken in mischief that hadn't echoed publicly in decades. Children danced. Elders sat in folding chairs, wrapped in wool blankets, smiling with eyes too tired to cry. Someone passed around a pot of deer stew. Someone else set a braid of sweetgrass burning by the doorway. They didn't need a parade. They needed each other. In that moment, under the long Montana sky, the tribe was not celebrating a victory handed down from on high. They were marking the end of a long resistance, a resistance born not in anger, but in love. The love of land, of lineage, of story. A tribal councilman spoke over the crowd, his voice cracking with emotion. "We never stopped being a nation. The government just stopped pretending we were gone." And in that sentence was everything. The fire in the cold, the memory in the silence, the name that endured even when it was struck from every ledger. Recognition did not define the Little Shell. It acknowledged what they had always been, what the wind had always known, what the land had never forgotten. The air over the bare paw foothills is still sharp in winter. Snow clings to the grass in long ribbons, and the sky, endless, wide, bone pale, presses down like it remembers everything. But today, something new rises with the wind. Not new in the modern sense. New like a song remembered after too many years of silence. It rises in voices, younger, stronger, unapologetically old. They are building lodges again, just outside of Box Elder, past the frost-rutted gravel road and into the edge of a grove, a half-circle of young men and women stand over a framework of bent saplings. Their gloves are caked in mud, their sleeves soaked from melting snow, and their hands ache with the raw learning of tradition. But the structure is taking shape. Willow ribs arched into the memory of a home. An earth lodge, not a replica, a return. A tribal elder, Howard Belcourt, watches quietly from a short distance, leaning on a cane wrapped in otter fur. His breath rises in thin clouds. He's seen many winters, too many to count without removing his boots and bending fingers. But this one feels different. They're doing it right, he says, not to anyone in particular. They're not asking for permission anymore. Around him, the little shell nation is awakening. After more than a century of forced invisibility, they are not just recognized. They are rebuilding. From the high plains to the riverbeds, from kitchens in Great Falls to community centers in Havre, the descendants of Ayabewe Witang are not just remembering the past, they are living into the future. On their own terms, with their own language, and with the old skills pulsing through new veins. In classrooms, children are learning Anishinaabe Moan. Slowly, syllable by syllable, the sound of the old tongue rises again. Some phrases are cracked at the edges, pulled from fragmented memory. Others are strong, carried by fluent speakers who once had to hide their words behind the walls of boarding schools. Buju, a teacher says at the start of each day. Hello. Minogijigad, the children repeat. It is a good day. Each word is a small fire. Each sentence, a rope pulled tight across generations. In another part of town, in a modest kitchen smelling of smoked deer meat and boiling tea, two teenagers sit with an elder named Dorothy St. Pierre. She teaches them how to make moccasins using a pattern passed down from her grandmother. The sinew, soaked and pliable, threads through the buckskin like breath through lungs. Every stitch tells them you were here, she says. Don't rush. They don't. Because they know now that the slow things, the quiet things, are the ones that lasted when all else was taken. Outside, winter presses against the windows. But inside, the old songs rise, not recorded, not downloaded, sung. And it is here, in these circles, in the beadwork, in the words carried on smoke, that the little shell prove they were never lost. Just unheard, just unrecognized by those who didn't know how to listen. But the land always listened, even before federal recognition, even before the documents were signed. The land remembered their camps, the bare patches where snow melted first, because a fire had been there for generations. The rivers still wound through the places where stories had been whispered into stone. The wind still carried the scent of cedar burned for blessings. The world knew they never left. Now, with recognition granted and the legal chains of invisibility finally broken, the tribe is reclaiming more than policy. They are reclaiming space. In 2020, the tribe finalized a purchase of nearly 700 acres of ancestral land near Great Falls. It was not ceremonial. It was foundational. A step toward building community centers, clinics, gardens, and homes. Toward building futures rooted in the earth that once tried to forget them. But the land never did. On a cold morning in October, tribal members gathered at the site, some driving hundreds of miles to be there. There were drums, tobacco offerings, a fire lit at sunrise. One elder, standing over a small rise of grass, placed a palm on the soil and said, "You waited for us. We're home. This is not a Hollywood ending. There are still obstacles. Poverty hasn't vanished. Substance abuse still lingers. Generational trauma does not disappear with legislation, but the nation, now visible, now legally whole, is facing those struggles together, with ceremony, with education, with breath. There's a cultural preservation initiative, led by young tribal members, gathering stories from elders before they're lost. They sit with tape recorders and notebooks, capturing recipes, medicinal plant knowledge, migration stories, and songs that no textbook has ever written down. And when an elder says, "I can't remember," they say, "That's okay. We're just here to listen. And often, after a moment of silence, the remembering begins. This is the future of the little shell. Not glamorous, not easy, but sacred. Because survival wasn't just about fire and snow. It was about holding the sacred when the world called you disposable. About singing when the wind said be quiet. About living with dignity long before dignity was legally returned. In a park near Havre, a boy practices with a hand drum. He's alone, tapping lightly, his breath visible in the chill. His rhythm is off, a little clumsy. But he keeps trying. That sound, carried into the grey sky, is enough. It echoes off the trees, through the brush, back to the earth, still here, still sacred. That's what the final chapter sounds like. Not a drumline, a heartbeat, not a parade, a homecoming. And it doesn't end, because nations don't end, not when they're made from memory and breath. The little shell never stopped being, and now the world, at last, is catching up.